to Melis Jacuzzi from Norway. Welcome back. PsyOp agent from the 52nd state. Is that Canada, I guess, or Greenland? Probably Canada. Esmil, always a pleasure. Elfish, welcome to a live stream, and hello from Germany. And Atlas, welcome. So today we've got a chap by the name of Portable Orange here, who's made a few excellent videos on YouTube, and one of which was about mythology, comparative mythology. And yeah, I had a few YouTube members and patrons message me about the video saying, have you seen this, John? What do you think? And I had a watch, and it was an incredibly interesting video. Very well done. A few things I wish you'd mentioned, but we'll talk about those today. Hello to a lot of people from the United States turning up. Hello from Virginia, Massachusetts, Albuquerque. I think some of you were here last time. Decibel 19, hello. Arkur from Germany. Hello, Jeff. Good to see you. Good to see you. And Stephen from Scotland. Oh, fantastic, fantastic. So anyway, without further ado, I'll bring the young man to the stage. Please welcome Portable Orange.
Hey guys, what's up? I'm Andrew, go by Portable Orange online. Do deep dives, just put out my 10th video yesterday on the moon landing. You should go check it out. But I'm an independent researcher. My channel started from someone being wrong on the internet, which I'm sure so many of you in the comments know is just an annoying thing. And from there, I just started doing deep dives into primary sources. My wife is getting her PhD currently, so in talking with other academics, I sort of realized it's possible for even independent researchers to do academic research. And I got really into kind of trying to find some of the truth behind some of the stories we're told about history that might not necessarily be true, or might have other explanations, or might be the result of sort of propaganda from the times. And so as my channel has grown, I've tried to put out that type of content. And that is very much what brought us to me and John actually getting in contact in the first place. People talking about how Roman mythology actually came from this ancient group of people, and me looking into that and what I found, and that's where the video came from.
Excellent. So yes, your video has a great thumbnail saying, I think it's Migrations Tick Mythology Cross.
Yes.
You know, that drives a stake into my heart seeing such a thing. But we can talk about why. And so what made you create that video specifically? Was there a story or mythology or culture that you'd heard to,
Well, interestingly, I did a series on Roman mythology. So I did a very long 3-part series. I think in total it was about 2.5-ish hours, going through kind of how Roman paganism started, how it evolved, and what it kind of became in the early empire, stopping, mid 1st century AD, right before Christianity really started to come into full swing. And in the very first video, because I did all 3 before I ever did, before I put any of them out, I talked about Dumasil, because obviously when I started researching, what about the early stuff, the archaic triad came up, which is something that has very much held up over time. And even though Dumasil wasn't the first person to come up with it, he really provided a lot of the interesting evidence for it. So researched that and said, oh, here's this cool guy. He came up with this one cool theory, but it seems like his other stuff, from what I was just reading from other scholars, seems to not be as popular these days, seems to not be as in vogue. Very brief throwaway sentence in a 2.5-hour long thing about this, go on with my day, put the video out. A lot of people in the comments started saying that I was wrong about this. I need to look into this. And again, one of the interesting things is, as an independent researcher, I think you always have to be open to being wrong, because I often describe my knowledge as deep but narrow, where like if you talk to me about specific topics, I can talk your ear off. And then you're like, so what about Roman military organization? And I'm like, oh, well, they had centuries, that was a thing, and other stuff. So that led me to looking into it. And what I found when I dug into some of the big comparative mythologists, I guess you'd say, but really just anthropologists who specialize in comparative mythology, I found basically that most of them were saying reconstruction not necessarily comparative mythology itself, but reconstruction based on comparative mythology has a lot of pitfalls. And it seemed like those pitfalls were what a lot of the people leaving comments on my video had sort of fallen into. So that's what led me to eventually making the video about the pitfalls of specifically reconstruction via comparative mythology.
Okay, so there's a couple of things there I think we should talk about to let everybody listening understand these things. So first off, let's talk about Doomazil briefly. So if people don't know, Doomazil in effect came up with a theory of the tripartite system, which if for people who watch my videos, it's where I talk about you have priests, warriors, and providers. In effect, society is based in three sort of groups, and you see that in the construction of the Indo-European creation myth that Lincoln and David Anthony sort of first brought to light properly. But Doomazil did a lot of other things before giving up on them, realizing that what he was doing really didn't quite hold sway, and that included, in effect, his version of comparative mythology. So, do you agree with that? So just
Yeah,
make sure
no, more or less. Yeah, I think specifically his thing was called structuralism, and structuralism is certainly a thing that still exists in some form. There are still adherents of Doomazil that enjoy that style of comparative mythology, but there's not very many of them left these days. But they are there in academia for sure.
Yes, we can talk about structuralism and universalism in a bit. That's jumping in the deep end. I think we'll approach it slowly. Yeah. So, but comparative mythology. So, what do you consider to be comparative mythology?
Well, I think like anything else, it's a tool. I think it's an interesting thing to look at to further research. I think if you want to look at stories from groups of people or something, see similarities and see, oh, I wonder if perhaps it came from some earlier group, using that idea to then conduct research and try and track that down where it may have come from, that I think is fine and I think is interesting. And to me, I think that's why I don't dislike comparative mythology as comparative mythology, because ultimately it's just a tool. The problem is what you do with that tool. Hammers are fine for building houses. They're also fine for bashing people's skulls in. But, we have rules about what you can do with hammers for that exact reason.
Yes. Okay. So, I guess defining mythology is a good place to start, because it really, in effect, presents the issues we have with what mythology is. Mm-hmm. So, in strict academic terms, mythology is part of folklore. Mm-hmm. But to stop people getting confused between folklore, of which mythology is part of, and folklore, which are narratives of the folk, because there are different things. The study of folklore is often called folkloristics to prevent that, which a lot of folklore people get a bit annoyed about, but that's it. And if you ask a folkloristics person what folkloristics is, no two people will agree. And this is the problem with dealing with words, which goes into comparative mythology, which is that if folkloristics can't agree what folklore is, and folklore is meant to incorporate mythology, then how can you define mythology, and let alone how can you define the narratives of mythology? So we've got all these problems that we can't create a measurable object for this. So comparative mythology is having a bad start, even before you get going. And I think that's one of the issues, that when people say mythology, we could be meaning different things. When we say comparative mythology, we could be meaning different things. So it's good to clear this up. So for me, mythology is or are narratives that have sacred truths in them. So they're religious type of narratives. And that's important for me, because that religious aspect means that I feel that they are more likely to persist over time, not necessarily in the same form, but the core narrative may persist over time because it is sacred, and sacred things tend to be better remembered. We'd like to think the non-sacred things, for various reasons, such as you could be considered a heretic if you get it wrong and they kill you. so the people who are telling it wrong aren't around to tell it wrong anymore. In the most extreme examples, don't do that at home, kids. It's not good. But but yeah, that's it, and that's why those narratives exist. But if you speak to, say, anyone who studies folklore and you ask them what mythology is, they may have a slightly different view. So I'll be interested, what would you consider mythology?
Well, I see a lot of mythology as people essentially trying to it's a narrative that is composed to explain the world in a sense, not necessarily from the term is often naturalism, but like from a sense of like the forces and everything all have names and whatever. But much in the same way you're trying to use the or not trying to the way you're using the word sacred truths.
Mm,
I think for me it's more about fundamental truths, universal truths, moral truths, the same type of thing. But it's essentially a way of constructing a cultural tapestry that can serve as a backdrop for things that don't necessarily have tangible things that we can like point to and touch.
yeah,
That's sort of how I view mythology. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so my stories would always have a god in, or
Mhm.
a demigod or something, where you think it's probably a bit anything which sort of in effect replaces science, because
Yeah.
we didn't know the science. Yeah, okay, that's
I,
quite
I
interesting.
I would even say to a certain extent there's like historical mythologizing. So in America we have this famous George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and he could not tell a lie. So when his father asked him, he said, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." And I would say that's a myth, which we're pretty sure it is, but it's more that's a myth in the sense of that's like the honesty of America. Like America is an honest nation, that kind of thing. Now, is that true? Historians can tell you probably not, but I think that that's part of like the cultural tapestry and us trying to,
I see what you mean. Okay,
yeah,
yes.
put on something that you can't
See, I
again
would consider
touch.
that more folklore. So,
Yes, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, because to me, folklore, again, you can't get people to agree on this, which is one of the problems.
fair
But
enough.
folklore
Yeah,
is a story that people tell. It's an English word. It doesn't come from German. Some people think it's a German term, or the Volk. This word, Volk, it isn't. It's an English term, and it's basically stories that people tell which aren't necessarily formally applied. So it could be chanting at a football match. It could be
true.
playing games in a playground as a kid. If all these people do it, you're not taught it. Is like formally, you have to know this story. People naturally, and you get these myths come up. I mean, I was on
Yeah,
holiday in Aruba last year with my kids, and I remember we were we were on a couple of boats, and each captain of the boat had this story where someone had managed to go from Aruba to Venezuela on some form of transport that is not considered normal, from
hmm.
you know jet ski to windsurf
Okay.
board to canoe or kayak to and then he was chased by the authorities and managed to get away. Everybody had this story, and it's like that that's folklore. That's magical to me. I love stories like that. But yeah,
Sure.
it's and that's then to me that's much the same as George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, or whatever those kind of stories. Okay, so yeah, we get this idea of that's the sort of mythology, and that comparative mythology you feel is a way of comparing narratives
Yeah,
for,
yeah.
for
It's a
various
tool.
reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And the
exactly.
issue is, or the reason you made your video, is that people were comparing narratives and making incorrect assumptions that they were perhaps similar or connected somehow, because they often contained linguistic similarities, came up quite a bit, but there was other similarities in there as well.
I think to a certain extent, but more of it was the reconstruction was specifically the thing I was trying to push back against. This idea that, because I think if you compare and you go, these are similar, maybe they came from an earlier source. I think that's fine. But then what you need to do is you need to come up with some evidence for that. And I think the evidence was stopping for most people at etymology. And I think
Yes.
JP Mallory has a really good passage about this in well his newer book as well, but his the 1999 one I think it was. But he has a passage where he basically says it's a cool hypothesis, but if we can't even test it, is it even a hypothesis? And I think that was more the issue I was running into, was the idea
Mm.
that like maybe this is true, But the problem is assuming it is and then building off that is, I think, where the trouble comes in. Where what I see it more as is, wow, that's so interesting. I wish we could look into this. Maybe there's something we can look for. Maybe we can design, oh, if we go here, we expect to find certain cultural markers or carvings of gods or forms of gods or something to that extent. Whereas I felt like most people were just stopping at storm god, similar name, definitely came from the same source, and I just felt like that wasn't quite enough to
Mm.
really build off of. Yeah.
Yes. You raise some good points. So one of the linguistic points you talk about is people often say in reconstructed Proto-Indo-European we find a very patriarchal bias or biases of
Yes.
patriarchy, and therefore the Proto-Indo-Europeans must have been a patriarchal society. People make
Yeah.
that assumption, and there is some archaeological evidence to support in terms of burials
Of course. Yeah,
that.
yeah, corded ware for
Um,
sure. Yeah.
but there's certain other aspects of that that you know may not prove that or could be lost. And I thought that was a very good point that as people migrate, let's say there was a particular feature of the landscape around the Black Sea where the Proto-Indo-Europeans probably came from, and they go to Anatolia or further into Russia or Europe, and that feature isn't there, you lose that word.
Mhm.
And therefore
And
you lose any mythology associated with that.
yeah, and again, in the same way we're speaking of sacred truths, let's say, for example, like a really common one I think is tsunamis, right? Like we get a
Mm,
lot of mythology, especially out of Japan, for like, beware of this town, when really it's just that's where the tsunami makes landfall. Like it, and it's a way of communicating that to people. And if you were to take that and then let's say the Japanese were to just travel to Mongolia for some reason and settle there, but held on to the story, because I think we agree stories are important. Now the question becomes, how does that get reinterpreted? Because it's probably not going to look to us like a tsunami necessarily. But if
exactly.
we see that spread out and in other cultures and other contexts, I think that's where again some of the problem comes is you're necessarily doing that reconstruction. Not that you have to, but people are doing that reconstruction when they're doing this comparative mythology, which I don't think you have to do necessarily. But I think a lot of people end up doing that, where they end up reconstructing through the comparison. And again, that's kind of the thing I was
Yes.
trying to push back against. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's a good point. And then we can push that further too, as you hinted at it just a moment ago about God's names.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
Zeus and Deus is a
Yep.
really common one that if any god is etymologically linked to Deus Vita, um, then it must be a god that is directly related to Deus Vita, rather
Yes.
than realizing Deus means in effect God, but sky, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
or gleaming one or shining one, which is always there's different ways of interpreting it, and that's
Sure.
and one of the things I try and tell people is that if you're going to read a foreign text, a translation of a text, if you can't read the language, read multiple versions of it because translation isn't always literal. There's narratives, translation and interpretation of it. So Deus Vita is Sky Father, but some people could consider it as Father Sky. You could see it as a glowing one, and Deus turns
Sure.
into God. So there's all these different ways of interpreting the name of this. And so when we get to Rome and we see Jupiter, which is absolutely cognate with Deus Vita,
Sure.
everybody thinks, well, Jupiter must be the form of Deus Vita, exactly what he was like, where that is absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
And so you can't place him in the same stories in the same way.
And I
Yeah.
think even to what you're saying, you run into the other problem of which came first. Was the sky father as a deity already present in whatever indigenous culture was there, and then it adopted a new name but kept the old characteristics, or vice versa, frankly? Um, or, was this something wholly brought in at the time? Because obviously we don't have evidence of what was the religion in Rome in the year 2000 BC. I think that is another element that again just complicates things and doesn't mean that we can't do comparative mythology, but it means that there's some real pitfalls you have to be aware of, because humans are really good at seeking patterns with our pattern seeking
Oh,
brains.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
this is how modern day comparative mythology is aware of that and understands that.
Yes.
So the names don't matter in modern comparative
Mhm.
mythology. Details don't matter. Details change with the landscape and with society. So I tend to have analogies like you don't hear stories of penguins in the desert because, as you say, words change or disappear if people migrate, but also the story changes to adapt to the landscape. So penguins may turn into emus if you get to South America or whatever, or wherever, or emus are Australia. So they change. So yes, we can talk about that in a little bit. So, but a really good example of that is Greece. So where you say sort of Rome isn't necessarily purely Proto-Indo-European, which it wasn't, because you had Etruscans before that who, there may be some influence there, but they weren't a direct descendants of those. But Greece, I think, is a brilliant example of a cultural mix. Absolutely, it's not an Indo-European society, a pure Indo-European society. We can get such a thing, because I think it's just bad to even suggest there is such a thing, because we don't know what that is. We're not. Is it 6,000 BCE? Is it 5,000 BCE? Is it 4,000 BCE? When do you want to stick the flag in it? And between those 2,000 years, I guarantee the pantheon changed, God's names changed, mythology changed. So you can't do it unless you're really specific. And I try and make that point, all the time, that if you're talking about a religion, you have to tell me exactly where and when that is happening. Otherwise, you're dealing with a really broad landscape, and anything goes. You're bound to be, as much as you're bound to be right, you're bound to be wrong, because there's other things going on.
And also in pre-literate societies, that's going to be an even bigger problem, because in Rome, at least, and Greece, when you have writing, it's a little easier to codify your myths to an extent. But in, pure oral tradition societies, that gets a lot harder to make universal kind of codifying claims about a culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got Esmil talking in the chat about Wiranos and Uranus. So I made a video about this, about it's because of Greece and how it's changed. And I tried to explain the pantheon. So without a doubt, the farmers from Anatolia or the Near East came to Greece before Indo-European people came to Greece, because they were there by the start, as Indo-European was probably Proto-Indo-European, probably started to be spoken in a form we can reconstruct. The farmers already hitting the door of Greece, and so they had plenty of time to get in there and do whatever they do and share their myths and pantheons. And we can see that when we look at the pantheon. The pantheon is not an Indo-European pantheon, and the names of that in that pantheon, only a few are Indo-European. That we can directly attest to. Demeter, who is the mother god in the Proto-Indo-European space, is now a sibling, a sister of Zeus, rather than a wife, I think, in the Greek pantheon. And Zeus is there, and his wife is now Hera. And Hera, I'm pretty sure, is probably an agrarian name, because we can't seem to reconstruct that using our knowledge of Proto-Indo-European. So it looks like there's a pantheon there. The Indo-Europeans are knocking on the door, and some of them get in, and some of them don't. Some of the mythology changes, and some of it doesn't. I don't know when we sort of spoke offline before this a month or two ago. I don't know if I mentioned Heracles. So Heracles is everything a storm god should be in Indo-European terms, but is not a storm god. He is not a god, in effect, in Greek mythology. That's a clear indication that mythology has been changed to reflect that. And his name reflects Hera, like Zeus's wife, not the fact that he is the son of Zeus. Or what's and I think that's a really good way of showing people that, there is a mix of culture here. And it's also the reason I stay away from Greek mythology in terms of comparative mythology, because you just can't make sense of it easily, unless you have a 200-page disclaimer at the start of it saying all these things probably happen and what time are we talking about. So I really get it.
And Greece is tricky too, because Greece, I think, was the door to the Near East in a lot of ways, because going through Anatolia, not many people were sailing the Mediterranean straight up to like Rome. They'd go through Greece because it was a lot easier. And we can even see that in their art. That was an interesting thing I found when I was researching, that the like square squiggles we associate with Greece, like Greek art, those are all Near East. and it was imported around like 800-ish BC or something, maybe a little earlier, 1000-ish,
Yeah,
and then
I
spread
think
out from there. So it's funny that like we have this idea of like that's Greek art, but to the Greeks, that kind of geometric stuff, that was all Near East to them. So yeah, it's
absolutely.
interesting when you see how stuff gets kind of transmitted through other cultures and through like
And
media.
that's yeah, that is so clear. So we see that with
Mhm.
Theogony, like the creation myth of the Greeks, with Kronos eating the children and Zeus. That's a Near Eastern creation myth. We have examples in Hittites, in Phoenicia, in Philus of Byblo, and down into the city of Dune, and down into Gilgamesh. There's hints of it. So we actually, although I'm doing some comparative mythology here, and I apologise without the detail, but we can
No, it's
see,
fine. I'm waiting. I'm waiting. At some point, I know we'll get into it, but it's fine. Yeah.
yeah, there's a clear indication that there's a path that seems most probable for it to have arrived in Greece, and it wasn't just their own thought independent of the Near East. The Near East certainly influenced that. So, and we see that with gods like Aphrodite as well. So we clearly see that Aphrodite is not part of the Olympians. In I think it's Minoan, in the Minoans that we find a list of the
Yeah, for
Olympians.
sure. Yeah.
She's in there, but we find her in again in the Phoenicians, and then and Ashtar or Ishtar and other gods and in the Near East. So it feels like people have transported her for some reason, maybe to do with fertility. Who knows? That's where it gets a bit dodgy in comparative mythology. You shouldn't make assumptions on why she's come along, but she seems to have come along from the Near East again, and that must be to do with trade routes and culture.
And it's tricky too because like Venus, I think, is a fantastic example of this. Venus and Aphrodite, because
Yeah,
if you told Venus and Aphrodite, you're like, well, these are the same goddess. These are clearly the same goddess. They came from the same source. But then when you look into it, you realize the Roman version of Venus, pre-interaction with the Greeks, was this very different kind of deity. Not so much of like a sexual love as much as it was fertility, and was a lot more associated, we're pretty sure, with fertility rites dealing with agriculture, not necessarily with like rearing of children as much. But it was
Mhm.
when they encountered the Greek gods and they decided to start, because of the way Romans thought about their gods, they weren't quite as fixed on like, these are our gods and we're going to fight with you because we have the right gods and you have the wrong ones. They were very sort of like naturalist in a sense. So when they encounter Aphrodite and they go, wow, look how successful Greece is, our Venus must just be an aspect of Aphrodite, and Venus suddenly gets reinterpreted. And if you don't have the archaeology from pre like 600 BC, you're going to look at those quite easily and say, well, that clearly came from the same source, when actually that was a later transmission that we're like reading back into it,
Indeed.
something that's in there. So yeah, like a lot of this stuff gets so complicated, especially from times we don't have great archaeology from as well.
And that's it. Yeah, a clear example of you have to be specific on times. So the the Venus of 200 BC is probably, can be said quite confidently, was most prominently influenced from the Greek
Mm.
Aphrodite, but the Venus of 600 BC in Rome probably was less so,
Mhm. And
because
may have come from that same Phoenician deity. That's entirely
but,
possible.
but
But
translated differently or interpreted differently
exactly.
because of how it
But
got.
we don't know. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. So what else? So because say Rome, say is more your cup of tea.
For sure.
So why are the Romans so influenced by the Greeks? Is it purely because many Romans migrated to southern Greece before they had their argument with the Etruscans, or is there something else going on?
I think the thing is Romans were very influenced by the Greeks in certain areas, but I think how influential the Greeks were on the Romans, interestingly, depends on your area of study. If you are
Oh,
looking at religion and art, the Greeks heavily influenced the Romans because prior to contact with the Greeks, Romans' mythology, from what we understand in their religion, was much more ancestor based and locality based. So the Lares are this very unique
oh, right,
thing in
yes.
religion that don't really exist as much in other what we consider to be Indo-European kind of areas. And we can see from a lot of how like early Roman they construct their gods. There's like a patronage thing, and we don't necessarily see that patronage reflected in a lot of the mythology of say like the Rig Veda or something like that.
Hmm.
And these gods are very personal, and so because of that, Rome didn't want to offend the gods by assuming they knew their proper names or their proper titles. And so they kind of allowed themselves this out of, we're only doing the rituals this way, we're only using the names like this because that's what we've done. And we've done it and it's worked. So we're not going to bother, why change things now? It's working great. Let's
Exactly.
not,
Yeah,
let's not
the
mess things up.
gods aren't angry
Yeah.
with us. It's,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. Maybe they should have, when they had Crisis of the Third Century, but they stayed the course. And so
Probably.
then when you start encountering Greece, the first thing is they get myths in a way because and this is a little bit, I will say, part of the difficulty of what I'm about to say is this is me reading into later writers. So the claim I'm about to make comes from people writing in like the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, but this would have happened around the 4th century BC, so 400 to 300 BC. But a lot of Greek writers claim that Romans had a mythless form of religion and that they didn't want to tell stories about their gods because they thought it would be disrespectful. Because if you think about the Greek myths where Zeus is going around sleeping with everyone and being kind of a horny goat, that's offensive to someone like Jupiter, who also has much more control than Zeus does. Jupiter controls fate, he controls everything, whereas Zeus, doesn't have nearly as much control. So they essentially didn't want to offend the gods, but once they heard these myths, they thought this is interesting. And it seems like Greece is doing okay. Greece isn't like suffering over there. So maybe it's okay for us to take some of these myths. We start seeing them appear in votive offerings, like artistic depictions of these Greek myths start appearing in votive offerings around this time. So clearly they're starting to kind of test out, showing them to the gods to say, are you okay with this? Given the history of Rome from, 300 BC to 100 BC, they grew a lot. Things got very successful for them. So they started just incorporating this on like a local level. But on the state level, they actually hated Greece to like an enormous extent because they were like, they're corrupting our values. Cato the Elder has this wonderful like long speech where he talks about how Greece is terrible and he hates the Greek language and he hates how people are learning Greek. And then he sends his sons to be educated in Athens because that's what all the rich Romans did. But like, there was a sort of a moral panic about what is Greece doing to our culture that obviously was kind of gone. But even in Nero's time, actually, because you can see Nero tries to do a lot of Greek things, such as when he performs on stage, that's considered to be very Greek. And Romans didn't like actors who performed for pay. If you perform for free as part of like a religious ritual, that wasn't seen as quite as bad. But if you were professional and you accepted payment to perform publicly, that was seen as like a bad thing. Whereas in Greece, that was seen as a normal thing. That was seen as like a lot of like why they were so influenced by Greece, they weren't as much as people think. But what they didn't have is they didn't have plays and they didn't have poetry as much. Cicero, I think, even talks about how Ennius, I think his name is one of like the first Latin poets. And a lot of what he did was just translate Greek works into Latin. And it was Greek slaves, Greeks who'd sold themselves into slavery in order to try and get a better life in Rome, who brought a lot of that art over with them. And some of the early playwrights were all Greek, just reinterpreting Greek plays, for a Roman audience. So but when you look at like laws and when you look at certain things like their system of government and some of their cultural things around like rituals, for example, their rituals were very, very different from the Greek rituals that they didn't influence as much. But the art and the like forms of the gods, they did really like to take from Greece and occasionally some specific rituals as well. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So couple of things. So first off,
Sure.
in the chat, I see chats whizzing around. I'll get to questions in the chat when we finish having our proper talk, because the community here loves asking questions. And
No, by all means, I
live
love it.
stream, I had an idea of what to talk about, and I didn't talk about it. I spent 2 hours answering questions, so we'll be here all night, which is great. But yeah, we'll ask the questions at the end. So, but my question to you then on that, Andrew, is:
Sure.
do you believe that early Romans did not have poetry or did not then tell stories of the gods? Do you believe that, or do you think that writing is accurate on that?
I think so. Some of the best arguments for this come from Mary Beard, who with I think Oliver Price and John North are their names. Price and North are definitely their last names, so I might be getting the first names wrong. But they wrote this very famous text called "Religions of Rome," which volume 1 is sort of the academic text, and then volume 2 is a source book. And a lot of what they point to is some of the earliest inscriptions and everything we can find, the earliest myths seem to be focused around family members. So it would be saying stuff like, here lies my uncle, he died, he fought in this war, he brought this thing. And then later archaeology shows that war never happened. That family never necessarily had a property there, or at least one that we can't find. So it seems like early on they did tell a lot of myths, but their myths were much more based on their ancestry. And when you think of Roman culture, that also makes a bit more sense, because for them, the ancestry and like who you were and who you came from was far, far more important even than necessarily what gods you prayed to, because you were allowed free association essentially for whatever god you wanted. So in terms of the gods themselves, they certainly had a little bit, because we know from like the Latin festival, there was this idea where Aeneas had founded the Latin tribes. Probably not Aeneas at the time, that probably was a later interpretation,
Mhm.
but someone who would then be called Jupiter. I'm going to forget the title, but like Jupiter the progenitor, essentially. I forget the exact
Yeah.
title, but
Well,
it's
here's
like
yeah.
he has a
Suffix.
lot of them, but that specific title was like Jupiter, the founder of the Latin tribes, which was later associated with Aeneas. So there is some idea, I think, to the Romans that they were descended from the gods in some form, and so therefore they must have had some stories involving some type of divinity. But the vast, vast majority of that, from what we understand, likely would have still centered upon the descendants of those gods, the mortal or semi-mortal descendants of those gods, and how they kind of built the society of Rome.
Okay, that's interesting to me. I find that difficult to believe, because I feel from my research that every culture before writing and before that told stories,
Yeah,
and the stories were told in poetic form, and they were often mythical to explain how the world was. And I think Lincoln says it best when these myths were split into two, sort of mythos and logos, which I could sort of
sure.
consider folklore and myth. So logos is like, well, like fairy tales and old wives'
Mhm.
tales and the like, and then you've got myths which are battles and gods and successful heroes type stories, and those, that mythos, it was the important stuff, to people, and that's what the Greeks preferred to believe. If they were believing anything,
Yep.
although there's a lot to say they weren't necessarily believing that really. And certainly by the time it gets to Rome, it's all called fabulae. I think Lincoln says it's, everybody doesn't really believe the stories, but you're saying them anyway because it's part of the culture. Like, I guess it's sort
To
of,
an extent, yeah. I'd say
yeah.
again, I think with Rome, there was a lot more of they were telling those stories, and they may have even been using poetry. But like, it's interesting when you read like Livy's history or something to that extent,
Mm,
and you'll find that Livy, whenever he's talking about historical events, which are mythical, we know they didn't actually, like Romulus and the war and the split with
yeah.
the Sabines, like we know that probably didn't happen, but like he will tell 3 or 4 different versions and he'll say, I don't know which one is true. But when we get like Ovid writing about metamorphoses or something like that, or retelling some of these stories, he doesn't say maybe it's this, maybe it's that. There's a lot more like this is the single story, which I think most people interpret as those must have been passed down later from other cultures because they'd already codified. Whereas when you think about like the early cultures that are stuck in oral traditions, there's going to naturally be a lot more variation because you have a lot of
Mhm,
different people talking about them. Now, I'll argue against myself even a little bit. One kind of caveat to that is you can look at Bacchus, Dionysus in the Greek
mhm.
version, where the Italian version of which was Bacchus. I mean, Bacchus was also used in the Greek
Wine.
version, but yeah, but they exclusively used Bacchus to refer to him in Rome. Is a very different character, but whether or not you pray to that character or worship that character changed depending on where in Italy you were. So there were certain rituals. And I think at one point, there's this very famous moment in Livy. The story in Livy is likely apocryphal, but we found decrees of the Senate, like carvings. So we know that the end result of the story happened, where they try and basically ban the cult. And one of the things they carve in there is, hey, if locally you need to worship this guy, because again, it's been working so far and we don't want to mess it up now, you can go ahead, but you need to get permission from the Senate because we want to make sure people aren't just, going around doing random stuff. So there is like some element of religion in there, but to the Romans, the I do believe their religion was a lot more supplicatory, and it was a lot more, you are the you're the patriarch, and I'm sort of, coming to you and asking for, could you do me this favor? And I do think that's something that is very different from a lot of other religions. And I think in many ways it's what allowed Roman religion to be so successful, so flexible, and go through so many changes, as we can clearly see throughout its entire history.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yes. I mean, Italy is quite geographically cut off from the rest of Europe. So I mean, Greece makes a natural neighbour in terms of sea voyage to it.
Well, and they were there. They
Yeah,
like
well,
they were
yeah,
colonists in southern
yeah,
Italy as well. Yeah, yeah.
they migrated there. But to go from Germany to Italy is a bit of a struggle
Yes, that's
because
true.
of the
Yep.
mountains. So yeah, I can understand how if things there develop differently, and it's quite interesting. Therefore, to make hypotheses on why that religion is different, and is it
Mhm.
because the longer culture was cut off from the rest of Europe, which may have had more interactions and more trade, because we do see certainly in the building of Stonehenge that we have travellers crossing Europe, even going as far as India. Although I'm not sure you could argue that's a direct someone directly went from northwest India to Stonehenge, but we find like beads and jewelry that are sourced from northwest India there, but they may have passed through Persia and but yeah, there was certainly transport and migration happening, so where it was easier anyway. So, but I can understand, yeah, to a degree, if Italy was slightly different in their approach to the gods. That's interesting. That's an
I
interesting
think
point.
also they did have some contact with Europe, but I think a big difference is Rome's contact with Europe had to be much more trade focused in a lot of ways. Because, like, if you think of the Etruscans as an example, we know the
Mhm.
Etruscans were outside the Alps slightly, a tiny, tiny bit, and we know that they did have contact with, I guess, not Northern Europe, mid Europe. I'm American. I don't know the geography, but like sort of, I guess, Bohemia, Germany, that kind of area
Yeah,
just
yeah,
north of
yeah.
the Alps.
Southern Germany. Yeah.
Um, yeah, Spain is north of the Alps. I'm pretty sure. I'm almost certain of that one. So joking, joking.
Yeah.
But like if you look at Villanovan culture, for example, we're fairly certain that had a similarity with Urnfield culture, because we're just from the burial practices we can tell there was some kind of through line there. Although again, it always gets tricky when you go back that far. The thing that I think is interesting about Rome specifically isn't, well, it sort of is the isolation, but I think it's more the fusion. In that very early Rome did seem to be, there was Latin culture, there was Etruscan culture, there was Magna Graecia, and we can see elements of all of those cultures in and around Rome very, very early. There's a very famous town south of Rome called Satricum, which had a temple to Mater Magna, which very famously is the Italian Dawn Mother that is not Aurora, the later thing that I think often gets associated with Proto-Indo-Europeans.
Mhm.
Um, Mater Magna was kind of her own, or not Magna, sorry, Mater Matuta. Mater
Yeah,
Matuta.
yeah.
Mater Magna was
Although
Cybele,
you
sorry.
could
Yeah.
argue that she probably wasn't quite a dawn goddess, but
Yeah, fair enough.
yeah,
But she was like her name literally is associated with the Dawn Mother in that
yeah.
capacity. Um, and I think something that's interesting is you see that town is very, very Latin, and they have a temple to Mater Matuta that's very Latin. And then all of a sudden, Magna Graecia moves up. They start trading with Magna Graecia. We start finding Greek potsherds in a lot of their kind of votive deposits, and suddenly they build a new temple and it's very Greek all of a sudden. And like you see that like Latins, I should say, weren't necessarily afraid of adopting these other cultures. And I really do think that was such a strength of early Rome. And then once they had a culture, they defended it with their lives, of course. But like they or very early on, I think they were not opposed to saying, hey, this element from this other culture works really well. Let's try that over here and see if that works for us as well. And I
Yeah.
think that to me, there is an isolation there to be sure, but I just don't want to downplay how much of early Rome, especially, was kind of a combination of local cultures in a sense.
Oh, absolutely. So it's that's a very clear behavior we see, is that cultures
Yeah.
take on other cultures' uh, deities, and all those deities' powers where they see them beneficial.
Yep.
That's absolutely, and that's really the Persians affecting the Abrahamic religion
Sure.
is quite significant in that respect. But yeah, we do see that all around. Okay, that's an interesting understanding of Rome. And something else we could touch on while we're in Rome then
Sure.
is when we talked before this, we were having a chat about Romulus and Remus, and in Jan P. Wells' Comparative Mythology, which is probably the book that most people who want to study comparative mythology probably buy first because it's quite cheap and accessible. He has a story of Romulus and Remus in it, and it's well constructed, and it goes back, and it suggests that perhaps Quirinus was, I think, would have been Romulus originally, and it gets changed, and he says there were sort of the mythology must have changed to become more sort of aligned to the Indo-European creation myth. Or that's how I see it anyway, because you can't kill Romulus twice. It was, I think, was his actual quote, where you can't have this, because the Senate originally is apparently meant to have courted him, and then he also becomes godlike by disappearing when he goes out for a walk one day. So, but then you mentioned to me that more since that book has been written, some archaeological discoveries have happened that makes it suggest that Romulus, to show that Romulus and Remus weren't a twin set at the start. So, do you want to talk about that? To explain to people, because they might be interested.
So very early on, like in Latin culture, especially, I think a bit in Villanovan culture as well, but in Latin culture for sure, there was a very strong tradition of the founder of a specific city or tribe or what have you, and it was very, very important that you, uh, listen to that person and follow the values that that person set out for you. And so we're pretty sure that early on, there's actually a bit of a debate in the scholarly community: was Rome named for Romulus, or was Romulus named for Rome? So, fairly certain the uh, in the structuralist interpretation of how Latins were building their myths, it wouldn't make sense necessarily to have a twin. And what we find when we look back, we find a lot of references to Romulus alone, and we don't see Remus appear, I think, until around, I want to say it's like 500 BC or something like that. Very, very interestingly, that there's that very famous statue of the Capitoline wolf, that she's nursing the twins. I think in like the Roman museum in Rome, and the twins, I believe. Oh, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but I'm fairly certain that the dating of the twins on the statue is actually more recent than the wolf itself. And so it's this idea that the twins may have been added later to the statue. Oh God, I hope I'm not getting that wrong. I'm pretty sure I'm right on. I might be thinking of a different statue, but
to me that's a really clear example. If I look at it with my biased Indo-European mythological hat on, that you're watching mythology change to adopt the better gods that had a better story. So they create. So there probably was a story of the creation of Rome somehow, but it became more aligned with the mythology of the Indo-European creation myth. Now, many people who haven't read Jan Prouvel's work or understand comparative mythology will say, "How can that be? That's very different." You have, they build a city on a hill. They're not creating the world. But comparative mythology, say, doesn't worry about the details. We just create mythemes to compare. But we'll talk about those, because I know you've done a bit of research on mythemes, and we can have
a little
talk
bit,
about
But no, but I think too, to that extent, and I'm sure I'll argue against this later, but I'll support you for now. Like to Rome, the building or to Latins, I should say, the building of the city was very similar to building a world, because a lot of their world was their culture. Like one of the super interesting things about Rome is, like, if you spoke Latin without an accent and you wore a toga and you did all the things the right way, there was a lot less of a focus on what you looked like necessarily. Certainly, like, genetics, where you came from, mattered. Don't get me wrong, ancestry mattered significantly, but like their emperors would often be chosen via adoption, because it wasn't even necessarily considered like you have to be genetically in the family. You could just culturally considered as part of the family. Like, really interesting things around how Rome viewed culture and their construction, as opposed to necessarily like the world or the city.
Well, was there a I guess a part of the culture that then try to artificially link themselves with gods, for example. So we see in
Yeah,
Anglo-Saxon
sure.
times, we see that many of the kings of early Anglo-Saxon England say that their great grandfather, 6 times removed, was Odin or Woden,
Sure, sure, sure.
just to show they, that even though Anglo-Saxon England is now Christian, they had that after. So, what did you get aspects like that? Was ancestor worship that important that these sorts of things were happening? So, if you're not telling myths about the gods, were people trying to associate themselves with gods somehow?
Very much so. The exact degree is unclear. So one really interesting example is one of the oldest temples we know of in Rome. We know of, there may be older ones, is a temple to Hercules on the cow forum, the bovine oh man, I'm forgetting it entire Forum Boarium, I think, or something like that. But basically it was a big trading forum, and it's right next to the temple, which is actually older, we're fairly certain, to Mater Matuta and Fortuna. It's a twinned temple. But the family who ran that temple, were the head priests of that temple, heavily associated themselves with Hercules. It's unclear to us if they said they were descended from Hercules or if they had just been given the task of maintaining the temple. And in Rome, the task of maintaining a temple or something like that was actually a fairly large honor. It was very common for someone who was in control of Rome at a certain point to build a bunch of stuff, and then they'd maintain it, and that was a mark of prestige. So certainly they dissociate themselves with gods. Now, certainly when you get to like Julius Caesar and even earlier Julii, very much claim that they were descended from Venus. They very directly make that claim that they had like divine blood in them. And of course, Romulus and Remus were eventually seen as children of Mars and a Vestal Virgin in one version at least. So like
Mars' child, wasn't it? The Vestal Virgin. I can't remember. Was it
say
the
again?
child of Mars? Was the
Yeah.
Vestal Virgin? It was, yes.
Yeah, it was Mars and in one version. In another version, it is just the Vestal Virgin and the King. But yeah,
there were about 10 versions of Romulus and Remus. I mean, because
yeah,
Livy's
exactly.
quite late, relatively in Roman.
Yes, very much so.
history.
Early Empire, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, you run into a lot of stuff like that. So part of the thing that gets tricky when peering back that far is they certainly associated themselves with gods. Did they say they were descended from gods or were semi-divine? Maybe. It does seem like one of the big things that we know from Augustus and Julius Caesar, Dio talks about this, is how in Roman funerals, we're fairly certain they were allowed to carry pictures of gods, but they were allowed to carry pictures of their ancestors. Then, when Julius Caesar gets deified, and I'm fairly certain also for Augustus, but definitely for Julius Caesar, their portraits aren't allowed to be carried in funerals for members of the Julii family because they are now gods. So you can't put them on the same level as humans and carry their like thing next to humans. So this is where it gets tricky because you can make the argument either way. You can argue that clearly they said they were descended from Hercules, they said they were descended from Venus all along. Or you can make the argument that, well, look at these funerary practices. Clearly, there was a separation between mortals and the gods that they never wanted to address, or not address, breach. So. This is like I say, it's tricky. There was some association to some extent for sure, but I do think it's a fairly important question of did they go so far as to say, oh, I'm a demigod, I'm semi-divine, and that's just not something I necessarily feel like I can answer with the evidence that we have. Yeah,
it's good to talk about these things. Okay, so then let's go and talk about another argument you had, which is around how different cultures can come up with the same ideas independently. And so therefore some people may think there is a sort of evolution of myth where really it's actually cultures just have that idea. And I think had a good chat. I think it was Gnostic Informant about the divine twins. So which are quite interesting. So the divine twins, I've made a video about it myself. I tend to be twins where one has a godfather, normally the chief god, and the other is a father of a highly ranked mortal, normally someone in the army. Two children are born. Whilst they considered identical, one is often named slightly in weaker terms than the other. So you go over Castor and Pollux, and and you see it within their jobs and what they worship for. So I think it is Pollux, I may be wrong here, who is like the god of horse racing, and Castor is the god of greyhound racing. And we have in Germany, we have
I'm less certain. I'll trust you on that. I'm less certain about this.
It may be the other way around, but Hengist and Horsa, we have one. Hengist is horse. Hengist means stallion, and Horsa just means horse. And what you find in these stories is that after a while, the lesser named god disappears often from mythology, and the strong one just remains. And so we have the divine twin of Rome becomes, I think, becomes the patron of the army. And in Anglo-Saxon mythology, Hengist is the warrior who takes over England, and Horsa's disappeared at this point. So that's quite interesting. But then I think you talk about Cain and Abel, and that being a very similar idea, that there's these twins that, well, although you could argue that normally divine twins do get on to a reasonable degree, I'm not too sure Cain and Abel.
You could take Gilgamesh and Enkidu. You could take the Mayan
the
divine
Near
hero
Eastern,
twins. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a slight difference there, and I do feel there is they did have different types of twins certainly in Indo-European mythology.
Sure.
So the twins of creation, normally sort of going back to Mano and Nemo, as in Lincoln would say, are different to the divine twins we see in later mythology, which are more to do with warriors and providers. If we look at the Dumazil hierarchy of things,
Sure.
And it's interesting to see how they developed and became associated more with horses as well. So it sounds like they're a later addition to the myth. So that's quite interesting. I certainly don't feel the divine twins were probably around when Proto-Indo-European religions.
That's so interesting to me. This is me coming at your end of things now. Sorry, am I lagging? Am I talking over you? Sorry,
no, you can hear you. Everything's good.
Because if there's one thing I would say we can probably attribute to Proto-Indo-Europeans, it probably would be horses. So it's interesting that
that's far later. That's more Yamnaya. So horses were quite late in the grand scheme of development.
Because the Indo-Anatolians, sure, okay, yeah, I understand. Sorry,
So to me, even though we say Proto-Indo-Europeans or the Yamnayas around maybe 4,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, I'm of a firm believer that at least 1,000, if not 2,000 years before that, Proto-Indo-European in a more earlier form was probably being spoken, and the culture was being developed somewhere on the lower Volga or around the Caspian Sea.
I've seen the Caucasus Lower Volga one. Yeah, there's some interesting genetic evidence for that. And certainly, I think when you look at the Indo-Anatolian languages specifically, it becomes very difficult to see the Yamnaya as the pure PIE.
Oh, they're definitely.
Yeah, no, I think we're in agreement on this, but I'm more just adding to your argument that, like, certainly Anatolia by itself is such an epine, if I'm speaking the French right, as Dumazil would say, in the side of the idea that the Proto-Indo-Europeans purely came from the steppe around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC.
Yeah, sure. There's certainly a mix of cultures, and we see that. So one of the real interesting, almost contradictions in their culture, I've just talked about this on a video I've made, is with the Earth Mother, where they have the creation myth has Yemo, like the primordial, these two divine twins. So I'll say this for the audience, because you may know this. They have these two divine twins, Manu and Yemo, and Manu sacrifices this primordial being of Yemo, his brother, and creates the world from his body. So the world is Yemo. Yemo also turns out to be Lord of the Underworld, and his body is also used to make all the people on the earth. But then they also have the Earth Mother, their god Meta. So Mother Earth, Mother Nature, also turns up. But how can she do that if Earth is made of Yemo? Is being made of Yemo? Does that mean that the Earth goddess has come from Yemo, a man? That that doesn't seem right. There seems to be big issues in that, and so to me, there's a clear indication that there's a sort of a tangible anthropomorphic sort of religious idea that's come in along with this dismemberment of primordial beings coming, and they've come in and not clash, but they found a way to fit them together. And so I'm saying that as Proto-Indo-Europeans were never pure, it's quite important, because I know there's a proportion of the world that has some weird ideas about the Proto-Indo-Europeans.
Yes.
And they are a mix of other cultures, and there's clear indications in what we can reconstruct with some confidence, and we can reconstruct the Earth Mother, and we can reconstruct the creation myth with confidence, I would say. The percentage of confidence may vary between us, but I think there is some confidence.
We could talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, I'd like to say that we do see this clash, and the best of other cultures joined together, which we've sort of spoken about. But the divine twins is an interesting one. So do you think divine twins is a universalist, or a piece of universalism, or do you think it is something that has originated and spread?
Well, I see.
Or then there's no.
And that's what I was going to kind of say is like from where I come from, it's like I have no idea, and I think that's very much. It's so funny. I had a fan who left a comment prior to me making the Proto-Indo-European video where they were saying, I'm comfortable with not knowing. And I was like, well, you know what? I'm here to speculate because I'm a YouTuber, God damn it. And then I remember when looking into the Proto-Indo-Europeans, I was like, I'm so sorry. You were completely right. I owe you such an apology. Yeah, it's I don't know. I can see the argument for universalism because I think just necessarily twins. I'm going to get a little Jungian, which I know is your favorite. But,
that's universalism. Yes.
Well, he's not the only one, but he's certainly one.
No, he isn't. But that's how I teach people. Universalism is Jung, structuralism is Strauss. That's
to an extent, well, Strauss hated Jung for sure, much the same way Jung hated Freud. But but I think that necessarily, like, twins are always going to feel special. The same thing with triplets, quadruplets, just because. If you're in a society where births happen and someone gives birth to two children, I just think that's going to be like an uncommon, strange thing. Yeah, and they're identical as well. And they cannot be identical. And I think that's the other thing that can be strange to people. And you even have, there's plenty of myths. I'm pretty sure the Bible even has a couple where a woman gives birth to twins by two fathers and she's cheating or something like that. Like that's how they explain it. Like the non-identical twins could be cheating or something like that, even though we know today
I think that's
possible, but that's
as opposed to the
very unlikely that happens.
Yeah. I mean,
but like,
I think it is possible to have twins fathered by different people.
It is, but it's very unlikely, just given what the timing would have to be. But it's possible for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
So like that kind of stuff, I think there's an argument for universalism to it, and the thing for me is that's where I want to hold back on saying this idea of divine twins necessarily came from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, because it could have been universal, but I'm not making the claim that it is universal. And I think even at the end of my video, that was something which maybe I should have put at the beginning of it, because I don't know how many people made it to the end. But like at the end of the video, that was something where I said, even if I were to say there's no way the Proto-Indo-Europeans spread their mythology, that would also be wrong, because I don't have any evidence of that either. My claim is more that using that reconstruction and building off of it is dangerous. So I hate to sort of, cop out of the question that way. But yeah, I guess my answer would be, I'm not sure. To me, there's a type of universalism that makes sense, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily what happened.
Okay. 1 second. Someone's just going off on one in the comment section. Right. So this is just for people, this is a discussion between me and Portable Orange about mythology, comparative mythology, and the like. We're not going to
send me an email. My email's in my channel. If you want to debate me, feel free to send me an email anytime.
Yeah, I mean, we're just having a chat. This is it. As you say, we're YouTubers. We like to speculate. It's good to talk to someone. Sorry, I don't know. I don't know what to do with computers. Right. So, and this is all we're doing, having a chat about these ideas. it's good to talk.
Yeah.
To talk. So, yeah. So
And again, I think this speculation, it's an important part of science. It's an important part of research because speculation leads you to coming up with like
you need to ask the
someone.
questions.
Yeah, and then you can say, "Oh, let's try and go to an archaeological site. Let's see if we can find things." Like how many amazing archaeological discoveries came from people who I want to say knew, but like were expecting to find something when they showed up there because they had a theory that I think this is what happened, and then they're proven right. And I'm sure that has to be the greatest feeling in the world for an academic. But like, yeah, this speculation is important, but I also think it's just important to contextualize that it is ultimately at the end of the day speculation. Yeah.
Yes.
To an extent, right? Yeah, I know there's some elements of it, but yeah.
Everything's probabilistic, which I'll get into later. So, but twins are important. So the chap who was or whoever they were was going off on saying like what twins means, whatever. But twins are important because to give birth to one child and survive, for the woman to survive, or for the child to survive, was not rare, but certainly. There was a risk of fatality in there. To have twins, it significantly raised that. So to have two identical twins that survived would be, quite outstanding, and it would be recognised locally. You're in a world that doesn't have newspapers and radio and internet, so if it happened locally, that would be a big local thing. So it's really important we understand and get into that mindset that these people didn't have, access to the communications we do. So localized things would be very special. So that was why we're sort of talking about that. So let's have a quick chat on universalism then and structuralism, because you mentioned that at the beginning. I don't know if people here really know what these really mean and why are we worried about them. In fact, we shouldn't be too concerned about them nowadays. Which was, I guess, my only criticism of your video is that it did concentrate as though comparative mythology was being taught as it was 70 years ago, rather than it is being taught today. In the sense that you're raising the points that people should now be aware of, but aren't. And it's a discussion because there are some people who read the old text because they don't understand there's new methods.
I don't even know that as much as they listen to people who read the old texts and try and because I like, again, I think I agree to a certain extent, and there were a lot of academics even in the comments of that video who were saying like, I still do comparative mythology, and I understand what you're saying, and it's not talking about the modern stuff. And my modern thing at the end, which was very, very brief, was because
I felt
well, but it also, I don't know, you would have liked it if I'd gone into it more though, because I did feel like a lot of what I encountered was very hyper specific, and it was very literary almost in a sense. And so it was interesting encountering that and seeing such a radical shift. But even again, some of the other post Dumazelian sort of, because there are still oh man, I'm forgetting her name, but there's some woman who is like, she's not doing the tripartite structure, she's doing like two tripartites or something like that, but she's trying to carry on like Dumazil's tripartite structure in a way. But anyway, point being, with comparative mythology, the specific thing I was trying to push back against was the Rome thing. And I think in a way I was surprised to find how many people had very strong beliefs about it in a generalist sense. Whereas the specific thing I made it for was, again, I asked my audience, what do you want for the 10,000 subscriber special? And one of the things they said was the differences between the Greek and Roman gods, which I already knew about. And I was going to make a video on that. But then in that research, because I said, well, the first thing I'm going to do is talk about Dumazil. And then in researching that, I found, I didn't realize Greece was this different from Rome. I knew it was fairly different, but I didn't realize to the extent. And then from there, that's what spiraled into the larger video. So yeah, it was in a sense attacking a very specific, I think unfortunately popular, but a very specific version of Proto-Indo-European studies that I don't think is really taken seriously at all in academia. But again, it just happened to be the thing that I encountered as a person on the internet doing independent research.
And you do raise good points. I mean, to me, I think you used Scott's book on comparative mythology. I think
that's part. Littleton. Yeah, that's part of it.
Puvel's, but certainly,
I use both. Yeah, Puvel's in there as well. Yeah.
So Puvel's, both books, but certainly Puvel's could do with an update. It's just a shame he's not here, but someone really needs to take that and do a, now we've got some
Well,
better
I think
archaeological
Anthony is coming out with a new book soon. I'm fairly certain he's announced it. I don't know if he has a date for it yet,
evidence.
but I believe he said he wants to do an update on Horse in the Wheel, obviously.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
I'll
yeah.
drop him a note then
And
and see what.
Mallory did one like months. I think this year Mallory came out with one.
Mm,
Um, although again, as with everything with Mallory, comparative mythology, he's doing Proto-Indo-European
yeah,
holistically, so comparative mythology is a smaller part of it. But
exactly. Yeah,
but
it's,
there certainly are some more updated versions out there for sure.
I just liked his approach. I mean, I've got 4 books I'm meant to be committed to writing, which I'm a year behind, but one of them will try and grab onto some of this anyway. It's
Yeah,
to do that. So yes, so universalism and
sure.
structuralism, we got there. So for people, as I say, if I had to explain it in a nutshell, like literally in one line, I would say like Jungian universalism, Strauss structuralism, but that is a real oversimplification. But well, I don't want to be
I
here.
think Dumasil also deserves a lot of credit for structuralism. I think
Structuralism, yeah,
structuralism is
yeah,
very much Dumasil's
yes,
brainchild.
yes. He certainly planted,
Yeah.
the seed. But I mean, I like Strauss because he came up with the original idea of the myth thing,
Oh
which
yeah, yeah.
I like. Even though that's now out of date, his version but yeah. So for people to understand why people go on about this, it was why do myths persist? Why do they spread? How do people have the same myths? And is it because there's a myth that is told in a particular way because people see the world in a particular way, and so you have this sort of more physicality about it, the structuralism, for facts like there's good and evil, or hot and cold, mountains and sea. They're these things you talk about, or then there's the sort of Jungian universalism view, which is that people naturally feel these things, and it could be argued that people, depending on how much you want to believe Jung. I'm not an overly enthusiastic fan of his. Somehow people can transfer this belief between them somehow over time and distance, and that may be just because of
No,
we
sorry.
hold.
Yeah, I think Jung's idea was more that universalism naturally arises out of the similarities of humans, because
Yes,
his whole idea was that myth is trauma in a sense. But I mean, Jungian psychology is crazy. This is all going to sound insane because Jung was a little insane.
read the Red
But
Book if you want to know how
yes,
crazy it is. Just open up the
but
Red Book page.
but yeah, he like a lot of his universal ideas, like humans have 2 eyes, humans have a brain, they
Mm.
have 2 hands. Our structure is the same, and therefore we have similar experiences, and therefore the way we explain those experiences necessarily ends up having the same similarities as us. Because obviously, just as John and I are different, I mean, I got this big old thing here.
Totally
You
different
can
thing.
also, well, your beard is more. I see. I can't grow the connection, so you've got me on. I would argue the more important part, because I will go bald someday. I don't know this will come in, but basically, like we have differences, so we're going to come up with things in a different way. But there's a universalist idea of the fact that humans are humans, and so therefore we're going to come up with the same ideas universally. Again, I'm not arguing for that. I'm just saying that's Jung's
Yeah,
idea,
I mean, and
and
both have
he
some
often,
credit. We're
yeah,
not saying neither is perfect,
sure,
but
yeah, yeah, yeah,
both have some value. But yes, certainly don't take each and its individual merits. Uh,
yeah,
Choose the best
yeah,
bits, and even then, you're going to be lacking in some aspects. That's what
yeah.
I would say. But yeah, I just want people to know that there's these terms out there, and if you hear people saying, "Oh, we're taking a structured approach," like Prop or Strauss or Dumas or the universal approach like Jung or Campbell or something, then you should be approached with caution. There should be more to it than that if you want to take it sort of seriously. So yeah, so
Yeah.
that's it. But the world has moved on, luckily for us, and
Yes.
so we don't have to do that. So if in terms of comparative mythology today, how I do it, so I rarely use the title, but in certain circles, I would be called a computational comparative mythologist. And the reason for that is that I get frustrated being in a folklore conference, and all the people around me can't even understand, tell me what folklore is. And then they look at these narratives and can't sort of compare them, and that frustrates me. So what we try to do in the computational side of comparative mythology using phylogenetics is to convert words into sort of something that is measurable and constant. And so to do that, we use mythemes. Okay, and so mythemes are, in effect, tiny plot points that won't be corrupted through interpretation, through sort of linguistic boundaries or cultural boundaries. So where someone may say Deus Puta did something, we would just say a deity did something. Yeah, and basically you get a story you want to compare with, get its mythemes. You break that down. That's used to be a manual process. Luckily, we've got AI and computers, and they can break it down. And then you just
not AI.
Well, it can save years of work, but it raises another point, which I'll bring in a minute. But yeah, when you create these mythemes, you can then compare any stories you want with that and tick the box and just compare, are they the same? And then you can look at where they are, when they were told, archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, and migration evidence, and create basically a probabilistic map of where that myth may have probably been originally sourced and how it dispersed. And that's really how we do it today. However, as you have sort of pointed out, however you define a myth theme is still subjective. And whether it's something matches the myth theme is subjective. So the problem is, when dealing with narrative, words are always open to interpretation, and whatever version of a narrative you're reading can affect the data you're using then to compare. So it's like you'll never get something that everybody agrees with. And so what we're left with is literally a probabilistic outcome of whether myths are comparable and the probability of where it originated from, through this pathway of how it. So we can never say, yes, let's say the flood myth definitely originated in Southeast Asia 40,000 years ago, but we can say we've got, for all the flood myths we know, we have a sort of 60% confidence factor that if it was to start somewhere in this form, that would probably be the place we would have heard it first. But it may not have originated there. It may have originated long before that, but we can't trace it back that far. We have those problems. So that's really the best we can do for really ancient type stories. And there's only handfuls of those that we could even do that with.
I'd be curious, are there any, and I assume obviously these would have to be modern, but are there any that we have 100% using specifically the probabilistic formula?
Not 100%. I wouldn't say. We can be very confident on certain things like Little Red Riding Hood, Beauty and the Beast, and things like that. We can go back to Proto-Germanic or even Proto-Indo-European. We can, but even then, even you go back to Proto-Indo-European, because we have a good understanding of the language and how that migrated. The culture before the Proto-Indo-Europeans, let's say there's a culture in the Lower Volga that 2,000 years before, they may have been telling that story, but we can't go back that far. So even if we're 100% sure that the origin of the story we hear today comes from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, we can't be 100% sure that is actually where it originated from, because it may have originated.
And interestingly, you're finding your way back around to the other type of universalism, which is the idea that, this is, and by the way, everyone listening, this is very much not popular. No academic seriously supports this anymore. But the other older version of universalism was that basically humans at one point were just monkeys, and the monkeys came up with the myths. And then when we migrated out, that's when we took all the myths with us. Again, no one takes this seriously anymore. But it's funny, as you're saying, we could go back farther, and I'm like, hey, at a certain point,
And there are ways. So we see myths. So there's two types of myths that are told all over the world. There are those that are universal and those that are structural. So it's like the flood myth is told all over the world, but that's because everywhere has floods. So even if there was an original flood myth, the fact that there's lots of floods everywhere helps persist that flood myth, could be argued. But the flood myth they're telling may have changed, and that happens. And in fact, the flood myth almost certainly the one is most popular is probably came from a creation myth where the world was a primordial ocean, which we see something called the Earth Diver, and
Sure.
that's a myth even told in Eastern Europe today as a creation myth, but has been adjusted to be sort of reflect the Abrahamic religion, but we can see it.
Well, I was going to say there's a Semitic religion or version of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So we see it. That's quite interesting. Even Noah's Ark is a reflection of
Mhm.
that early myth because of the dove flying out. So yeah, that's interesting. But then we get the other myths like the Seven Sisters, the myth of the Pleiades, which we
Mhm.
see strongly in Greece, but also told by the Aborigines in Dreamtime, and
Mhm.
we know that is old, not because everywhere, well, everybody saw the Pleiades, but I guess I don't know how best to explain that. I guess because it's more sacred than the flood myth. More special in terms of something in the sky. It persisted because it was constantly there, not because it was a major event that affected how people lived. There's a
I think that the Pleiades are also vague enough to map onto multiple things as well, which I think is an important part of it as well, is the finer and more discreet, as Strauss would say, you can get
yeah,
with the mytheme, the easier it is to sort of flex it, not flex it necessarily, but make it slot, like you were saying with you don't tell stories about penguins in the desert. If you
mm,
have a very, small discrete thing where it's just a god has a hammer, which I know we wouldn't be able to trace out, but just bear with me.
mm,
You could take that and slot that into a number of stories much, much easier than you could a god has a hammer and built this thing and did this other thing, blah,
mm,
blah, blah. So I think with the Pleiades specifically, probably part of the ease in it is just how simple it is and how necessarily
yeah,
it's easier to slot into various cultures as well.
yeah. And we see that with the cosmic hunt, which I have
Yeah.
to say
Yep.
carefully with my English accent, where there's a star in the Ursa Major. So most of the cultures that tell us this old hunting story use the same constellation. And this we know was told long before constellations were ever a thing. So while they're all using the same constellation, that makes us feel the story comes from the same point. But there's a star in that constellation that has a very faint star right next to it that you wouldn't necessarily obviously see with the naked eye unless you stopped and looked. And that's always called a dog, or usually called a dog in the myth, or occasionally pots and pans. But there's this hunter that's carrying this or has this with them. And that gives us, again, confidence. It's those little elements that gives us confidence that the myth was passed on rather than thought up independently.
I'd be interested because I think again, one of the weaknesses I think of my video, which I actually, when I was writing it, I thought would be a strength, um, was that I didn't deal with the specifics as much. Because to me, my overall
Yes, you
critique
did.
was methodological, and so for me, I said because I looked into a couple proto-Indo-European myths, certainly the creation myth. I mean, comes especially. I mean, I read Lincoln. He's talks about the creation myth a lot. Um, like but to me, I said, well, I'll keep my critique methodological because why pad out a video with an extra hour of me going through specifics and some of the problems with it? And honestly, if I could go back, I think I would have spent more time on that, even in research. Because again, I didn't research it as much as well. And then my most recent video on the moon landing, I spent a lot more time going into specifics because even though my overall critique is methodological, I figured, all right, well, let's try giving more specifics and see what people think about that. So I'd be interested in a lot of these interpretations, how the constellation was viewed and the time period at which we're talking about. Because obviously, stars, the night sky we look at is similar to the night sky that they used to see. But back in the day, just due to less light pollution and
Oh,
also due to.
excellent. You've fallen into my trap.
Oh, all right, go ahead. What did I do?
Because the story told in the Cosmic Hunt is related to the Ursa Major. And the
Sure.
story goes that the Ursa Major represents the hunting party chasing an animal.
Hmm.
And at the end of the hunt, at the end of the year, the animal dies and lays on the ground dead or goes underwater.
Gotcha.
So Ursa Major has to drop below the horizon. And it doesn't do that today. It didn't
Hmm.
do that 10,000 years ago. It didn't do that 20,000 years ago. But it did do that 30,000 years ago.
I was going to say in
And
no parts of the world. neither northern nor
Well,
southern
well, where
hemisphere?
we see it up north, it didn't.
Oh,
So,
where we see the myth.
it's really,
Sorry, you're right.
well,
Okay, sorry.
it's
Yeah,
told
I
in the
understand.
southern hemisphere occasionally, but then they changed
Mhm.
the stars to Orion and Betelgeuse.
Gotcha.
Um,
Okay.
but the northern hemisphere, no, it's and because it's told, strongly in First Nation American tribes,
Mhm.
in Siberia, in Europe, even into Greece and the like, and even in Northern Africa.
Mhm.
Um, say with this little star, which is a dog, with the animal going under that, and in Siberia, the animal is a mammoth, by the way, to give some indication of age as
Mhm.
well. All these things just again gives us confidence. Little pieces of information gives us confidence that this is probably quite an old story.
Yeah, and things like that I think are interesting, but again, I think a lot of what my video is running into, and it's difficult because I wish I could have a better conversation about the specifics, but unless we're dealing with like specifically Rome, I'm a lot more out in the cold. But I do feel like a lot of times when I've sort of looked into the stuff, my questions always come, how are the specifics being portrayed to the general? Because necessarily anytime you're doing any sort of comparison, you're pre-selecting for myths that are similar. And then I think the question comes from, if you're already pre-selecting for that, and then you are going to say they came from a common source due to the similarities, in a way, you're only ever going to find things that are going to support that, which is part of why I was so curious if there was ever 100% thing that you were
Yeah,
able
so
to sort of
there is,
decide
and it
from.
isn't quite like that. So when you look at when we look at very specific myths in specific ways, we will tend to
Mm,
concentrate for looking for myths in very particular parts of the world where we know migration events happened.
sure.
So, for example, if we think there's a myth that starts in Africa,
Mm,
we will look for myths in Spain and Egypt and the Saudi Peninsula and Israel, Near East, and
sure.
look at there and see where we find the most common mythemes repeating. And if they change, why do they change and what are they changing
Mm,
into? And you can sometimes associate that with cultural changes and landscape changes and things like that. So, uh, yes, by doing that, you are only picking stories that we know to be similar, but we do that's so I run something called the mythology and folklore database, and that
I
has
took a look at it actually because I saw you
oh,
mention it. Yeah, it's very
yeah,
impressive. It's very, very impressive.
it's got a few 100,000 narratives in, and it shows
Yeah.
their dispersal, and we can use that to pinpoint. So I've leveraged the Bearskin analytical catalog within that, and so if you're looking for a myth with a particular motif, such as let's say the Earth Diver for creation or something like that, to primordial being dismemberment, you'll just get the narratives for that. Um,
Yeah.
and yes, okay, you are creating bias by just taking those narratives, but
Mhm.
you then have to assume that the person who took those narratives did a good job at defining the narratives you've taken as being part of that motif. Um, and you are looking for that. You can then compare that data with all the other stories if you want after that, but you still want to have that. You're not saying, you know, which stories have that similarity. You're saying all the stories that have that similarity, how probable is it that they are evolutions of each other, or have dispersed from a single source?
Well, and I think that's the interesting question too. I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question, frankly. Between I think where the two of us, because I think we agree on the vast
Oh,
majority
absolutely,
of a
yes,
lot of
yes.
stuff. But I do think this is an interesting point of disagreement because for me, the probabilistic approach, I almost would want like a base, like a constant somewhere. Because for me and my experience, like the very first video I did was on homosexuality in ancient Rome. And what I found was this guy Ramsay McMullen had made up a quote that had then been used by the guy I was responding to. Now, if you Google Ramsay McMullen, what you will find is he was one of the foremost Roman scholars of his time. I'm fairly certain he was the head of the classics department at Yale. This is a very accredited individual. But when I looked not just at English translations, but the original Latin of Quintilian's Minor Declamation 337, the specific one he was talking about, I realized that he had added words that aren't in the Latin or any versions of the Latin. And from talking to other academics, what I found is stuff like this isn't I don't want to say it's not uncommon, but like a lot of academics have been like, oh yeah, sometimes you make these mistakes, sometimes you add these words, sometimes it goes through review, peer review, stuff like this gets added. So
It
for
all the
me, yeah, this all happens. And so it's interesting when you're saying you have to trust the person put it in there. That's immediately for me where I'm like,
you
I don't
you
trust
don't
anyone.
okay,
That's
you
why
don't
I
have
want,
to,
yeah,
but
yeah,
if you want to find all the stories relating to the dismemberment of a primordial being,
sure,
where do you start? Do you go to the Library of Congress or maybe to the British Library and take every book out until I've read all 2 million books and have all the narratives, or do you assume that someone has done the work? And even if and we often say when we do these studies, we've got a collection of books, let's say from the Bearskins Analytic Catalogue, and there is a bias there. I mean, the bias tends to be Eurasian and African. There's less
sure,
data for First Nations because just have less data. There's less data
of
for
course,
South
yeah, yeah,
America and all that. So, but we do take that into account, as part of the sort of probabilistic outcome. But it's why you never get 100%. I mean, we're honest enough to say, you're not going to get 100% with, even though in my videos I may sound really confident that, because you got to sell the video. I mean, otherwise no one will watch me if I
no,
say,
no, no, of course, no, no,
oh, there's only
I
a
understand there's an
30%
element of
chance
that,
that
of
this is going to
course,
happen.
yeah,
Sorry, everyone, by the way, if you didn't realize that, but I do try and say I normally try and say it's probabilistic. But yes, you can't do that. And yes, there is bias in the data, there is interpretation, words are subjective, and that will always be the problem with comparative mythology, is that even if you're happy with all the archaeological data and like, narratives are subjective. That's why you have multiple interpretations of the same text. I have the Poetic Edda, which is the
sure,
Old Norse myth. I've got
yeah,
now 13 different books of the Poetic Edda from different authors, all, and you talk about words changing. You
yeah,
look at that. They're not only do words change, and we find the very earliest translations use really quite archaic English, and I love it, is it, because it's far more descriptive. You can make more from it. But what you find is then later authors use the same words to try and replicate that feeling when actually they may not be appropriate to then use those words. And then you get modern authors that then completely rewrite it to contemporary English, such as Jackson Crawford, who does some amazing work on YouTube. But his first revision, because it was brand new, he actually got some words completely wrong. And,
sure,
and, and because there aren't people around to peer review it effectively for
yeah.
him. So he's now releasing a second version of that the next, imminently, which is probably worth a guess. So yes, there will
Well,
always be
and
problems.
even ignored translations, the problem can be one step earlier. Like in Roman history, a problem I've run into many times is the manuscripts. Because like for Suetonius, we have like 12 different manuscripts, which obviously none of them were written by Suetonius, who was writing in the first century AD. Those have all deteriorated. They're
Hmm,
copies by later monks. I think the earliest is like very late 8th century, like 790 something.
very common.
And when you compare those versions, you'll find slight differences. And sometimes people choose a certain version as opposed to another version because they like the way it sounds. But that further complicates the whole thing because obviously we don't know what Suetonius wrote. We can make a very reasonable, again, to your point, 99% approximation. But to me, at least, like the specific reason I was asking about the 100% thing was more like if I don't go back too far, for example, I can certainly point to some myths about Jesus, for example, that we know came from other prophets, apocryphal preachers in the Levant around the same time. John the Baptist being one of the big ones, obviously,
Mhm.
where some of his myths got mapped onto Jesus. And I think what's interesting is there's a way in which baptism as a mytheme, I think, does appear in the fire and water mytheme. That's like a common one I think you see in Indo-Europeans that has this idea of like cleansing, purification, like somewhat like baptism. However, we know that baptism is not Indo-European necessarily because it comes much more from Semitic and Near Eastern traditions that we can find. So the interesting thing for me is if you don't necessarily go all the way back to the beginning, like the originator point, where you could necessarily look at, say, this is something that we can point to. Because for me, at least, the more the probability stuff is interesting to me. But there's also a point where I think to myself, what necessarily can we construct off that if at the end of the day all we can say is even 80%. Because if we have to walk around with this 20% idea that we may be completely wrong, how much is safe to build off at that point?
Okay, so yeah, so the 80% is only because we're applying a mathematical formula to the data. It doesn't mean if you said 1 plus 0.8 is 2, everybody said, well, no, it's 1.8, but 2's near enough. Let's go with 2. And lots of people round up. Why can't we round up in comparative mythology? But then it gets dangerous to how much do you round up or round down?
But also, it's like 1.999 repeating is 2. That is equal to 2. They're the same number. But that can be counterintuitive to people who aren't familiar with that level of mathematics. And I think to a certain extent, it's really interesting that 1.99 repeating is equal to 2. Because when you're looking at the concept of what is a number and how is kind of the universe structured in a mathematical sense, even like infinities. I forget his name, George something, but he came up with this idea of cardinality, that there's different, some infinities are bigger than others.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is like mind blowing stuff.
Plus 30 is like 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. One's got numbers, but it's the same. It's still infinity.
Yeah. And his whole idea is there's different infinities because if you take all the real numbers from 0 to 1, you contain all the numbers from 0 to infinity plus a bunch more because of how decimals work. So you end up that has to be a larger infinity than the other number. However, if you do all the numbers from negative something to infinity, you're going to run into the same thing. So these things are interesting, and I think when we're trying to construct things such as myths and where they came from and the stories of our stories, the stories of how our stories arrived at us, this is where I think that nuance actually is very important. Because at the end of the day, the things we are trying to figure out, the things that we're trying to suss out of what I think we both agree is the very limited data that we have access to, because obviously we can't just go back in time and talk to people. That's where I think again, it's why I don't trust scholar. Oh, to your earlier point, sorry, I was going to say that. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here. But to your earlier point, when you were saying, what do you do? Do you read 10 million books? Yeah, that is what I do. I go on JSTOR and I type in something and I get an article. And that article gives me a footnote, and that footnote references some other author. That author references another author. And slowly I'm able to build out what all the authors say. Then I see what primary sources all the authors are referencing. I can find that from there. And then typically within those primary sources, those primary authors have written other works. I can read stuff off that. And you can build something out. It's long and it's tedious, don't get me wrong. But that's why, to me, my companion document and things that I do. And so, again, to wrap it all up, because I know this is very rambly, but that's where I think a lot of my nervousness comes from these probabilistic claims. Because at the end of the day, what I'm always wondering is, what's the bedrock underneath it all? And I think at the end of the day, the idea of it being there's enough similarities that we can make a claim towards an idea of a chance. Well, that's probably a bad faith way of putting it, but I think you understand. It's like the nervousness comes from the lack of certainty and then building off of that.
But like all science, it's what is the most you write down the most likely sort of answer to the problem, and for someone to come up with a better answer to replace it. That's what academia is about. Your job is to find better answers, and so until someone finds a better answer, go with this. But I wouldn't publish a paper where a myth is only 20% confident or 30% confident. I would really have to feel like I couldn't even get to 2 standard deviations away from 100,
Sure.
like 95, whatever. Like someone said in the comments, but certainly 80% plus, and with and with all these other little bits of information. So the more archaeological information you can get to support it, more migratory information and DNA information, which helps support it. That all helps, although it's hard to quantify that as a percentage of probability. So until then, but it's like the creation myth in Greece that Hesiod tells of with Kronos and that. We can say with 95% confidence it is the same creation myth as being told in the Near East, from the city of Doom, in terms of matricide, patricide, incest, and gods get castrated with sickles and the like. There's bits in there that you think people don't just come up with that, and the hierarchy of events and the reason of the myth, which is to create credibility for the chief god being the chief god. Zeus is Zeus because he saved the day.
Sure.
And all that makes come up with a better answer. Until then, I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best possible choice of a bad bunch. That is most like we feel confident that is the case. As confident as we can say with reconstruction of the Proto-Indo-European language. In fact, probably more confident than Proto-Indo-European reconstruction because we have more data going in.
But I think in a mathematical sense, like physics, I think is a good example of this, where you have gravity, is first really put into its formula by Newton. And what a lot of physicists find is that Newton's model fails at describing a few things. And I'm forgetting the name of who came up with the law, but there's this idea in mathematics that all systems are either incomplete or inconsistent. And your goal is to find incomplete systems because those are much better than inconsistent systems, because then you can guarantee, okay, I don't know how to divide by 0, but 1 divided by 1 is always going to be 1. So that's far more useful than I can divide by 0, but sometimes 1 divided by 1 is equal to 2. So I think one of the things that, again, I don't mean to hammer we can move on. I don't mean to hammer the point too hard, but to me, I think this is one of the things about this probabilistic way of viewing things is the question of, is it incomplete or is it inconsistent? To where I think a lot of times, to what you're saying, we come up with the best thing and then we wait for someone to come up with something better. I think a lot of times we don't do that in science. I think a lot of times we do come up with the best idea first, but then what happens is people run into walls and they sit down and they try and fix those walls. They try and come up with relativity. They try and come up with, okay, here's a way we can improve on that. But until then, this is undefined. Until then, maybe someday, not definitionally, we won't ever know how to divide by 0. But maybe someday, in the same way we came up with the square root of -1, right? The imaginary numbers. That's something that theoretically shouldn't exist. But the fact that it exists makes a lot of math so much easier. So we continue to use it. However, in the back of mathematics minds is always this idea of maybe there's another explanation that we're not looking at. And people do occasionally put it forward. It'd be a lot to overcome at this point with the body of evidence behind it. But that's where I think, again, it's not so much that we necessarily come up with the best thing and move forward, as much as it really is about we come up with something that works as far as it works, and then we work on filling in the gaps and filling in the solutions and filling in. So I talk with my hands too much, but that's anyway.
Yeah, that's fine. I was wanting to raise a point. DBK raised a good point, which is that skepticism is a good value, but it needs to be verified by specific issues. Having a general suspicion for it isn't good enough. So, I think that's perhaps where we differ, in that I'm comfortable with what I do, even if you're less comfortable with it. But if you could give me specific issues on specific outcomes that we generate, then we may be able to address some of your issues.
Well, reconstruction.
Yeah.
So the concept of, let's say, for example, when you're reconstructing the hunting myth, it's, again, something I'm not familiar with, but we can go off of that. The idea of if I take these various similarities, because theoretically I could construct for you slaying the dragon, right? Slaying the dragon is a bit broad, I think, for a mytheme, but certainly if you get to slaying the beast or something like that, is something that we can see in pretty much all cultures. Would you necessarily call that universal, or would you call that universally inherited? Whereas I think it's more just that's probably a natural thing for humans to defeat large beasts and for things to come about as a result of that. If I were to then, and again, I'm not saying this is what happened, but I'm saying if I were to then pitch that as, now my big beast is going to have wings and teeth and claw. This is sort of the Jordan Peterson, I think, does this a lot with his analysis of fighting the dragon. That it's the perfect. Sure, no, I know. I'm not the biggest fan of his, but I'm just saying, it's this idea of a dragon with, is the top predator. And then I think he always throws in fire and he goes, "What's fire? It's scary." But I'm just saying, you could theoretically construct this idea from a smaller concept. And the question becomes, if I break down the concept small enough, such as in the case of the hunt, where I just say, um, hunting, I think I think we could agree hunting is a fairly universal human
Yeah.
experience. Um, and then if you want to say, well, the stars are the things we're going to hang our hat on, that's where, again, I feel like, well, now I need to dig into how are the stars contextualized, which is, I think, what makes and again, I think this is the problem with my video. My critique is more methodological. It's not
Mm.
specific.
And I mean,
And so
you
it's,
raise all good points in those methods. Yeah, there's nothing I would disagree with pretty much everything you said in terms of that, the methodology and the things you raise. Absolutely.
yeah, and that's where I think for me, it's like, to me, I feel as though I am raising a specific here in
Mm.
trying to communicate that my concern isn't necessarily with a specific outcome so much as the concept of basing reconstructions on probabilistic kind of bases.
Yeah, we wouldn't reconstruct a myth. We couldn't ever reconstruct. I mean, when we talk about Lincoln actually says he's constructed the creation myth. He hasn't
Sure,
reconstructed it
yeah,
because you can't do it. I mean, and that's what I do. So when we go back and have this source, there isn't actually a source myth, just source myth themes. So then I just have to put my really poor English language skills to the test to create a contemporary language story based on those myth themes joined together. But it is a construction. It's nothing more than that. And again, I will tell that to the viewers that this is a a construction. This isn't what was actually told. It's just a version that could have been told, something like that, because
sure,
it's
but
all
then
problem.
I think you could take that one layer down then, in terms of the reconstruction of the mytheme itself. So if you were to take, like I said, like the idea of something slaying a beast or something like that, or the fire. Let's even take the fire and water mytheme, right?
Mhm.
Something I'm a little bit more familiar with, although I've only really read 2 articles on the subject. But like the there's a certain element to which you can break it down. But if you, I think this was something I even asked you in our conversation earlier, the idea that, like, if I can find a mytheme in an unrelated culture, does that cast doubt on the connection of a mytheme that we can find in far more related
No,
cultures?
that's really, yeah, that's interesting. So now and this is where we can start thinking about, if you understand what a myth is and if what we're talking about is a myth, then you may want to start reading some Eliade. So because he has an interesting view, which is, so Eliade was Lincoln's professor at
Hmm.
Chicago,
Yeah.
and he did a lot of phenomenology. So he tried to participate in the religions that he wanted to learn about, to understand more. And he, I find him really interesting to read. Really interesting. The Book of Eternal, the Book of the Eternal Return or something. The Story of the Eternal Return. Very good. And The Sacred and Profane, two really good books. But he talks about that everything we used to do was ritualized. We never. This is probably sort of hunter-gatherer days, if I want to put a broad term on it. That we never had sort of spare time to chill. We always did things with a purpose. And so if everything was ritualized, a ritual would create stories as to why you did it in a particular way. And so all myths would have a story. And that's where if we get a narrative and get to these motifs, those motifs would have a meaning. And you're right, some of those we won't get, but some of them we might. And if we do, and they fit into the context of the myth, then does that increase the probability of that myth being a more valid construction than if it didn't? Is that what you're suggesting then?
Well, I'm saying, let's say, just as an example, let's say, for example, I don't know, I'm not super familiar, but let's take the Indo-European creation myth. Let's say we were to take the twins, and let's say Romulus and Remus. They do go all the way back. They've always been around, and we know. So, like, Rome's idea of the creation myth and the Norse idea of the creation myth, with the twins and sacrificing one to create the world. Like, let's say that's the same. And then we find the same myth appearing in, let's say, a random South American tribe that was not
Mhm.
necessarily contacted. My question is, at that point, does that cast any doubt on the connection between Rome and the Norse creation myth in that sense? Obviously, the creation myth is a bit bigger, so I mean, fill in whatever mytheme you'd prefer. But that's more what I'm saying. If you can find it in a group of people that are unrelated to the other two groups of people that you're using this mytheme,
If they're completely
yeah,
unrelated, and then that, that raises, a couple of questions. That's where we
Sure.
go to, universalism as opposed to structuralism. But it wouldn't necessarily affect it, if we're feeling confident that the Roman and Old Norse myths were connected, then that confidence would remain.
But I'm saying if
Even
the
if we found
confidence comes
then
from certain data points, and one of those data points is a similarity, does the fact that this similarity can arise through non-inherited sources, again, theoretically,
it could, but so when we do this, we look at dispersals and migrations,
Sure.
and if we have an outlier, we have to think, why is that an outlier? And we do find this, and sometimes we find Christian missionaries have gone off to South America and told a Christian story that has overtaken the local myth for a
Sure.
particular thing,
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
discovery of water. It happens. So, and it may be that has happened, or it may be that they have. We can't find any reason other than they came up with exactly the same idea, which is improbable if we're looking at a long list of myth themes, but not impossible, which is why everything's probabilistic. If we take a question, because
Sure,
I've
yeah.
given all that. So S. Mill, who's a patron and who asks me lots of questions, keeps me on my toes. He says, let me actually put it on the screen. Aren't most historical conclusions from ancient history probabilistic, but scholars just don't put a number on it?
I mean, I would say no, because I would say I think that used to be a bit more the case in the older historical traditions, because a lot of stuff you find a lot of histories written 1800s kind of Enlightenment era, where it's like this is what happened, and I'm going to take the ancient source as true. Whereas I think now a lot more of what I've encountered, at least in my historical research, is historians take the time to say, hey, we have a couple different accounts that say a couple different things. Here's sort of like one story we can tell. Maybe this one makes more sense, maybe this one doesn't. But at the end, they usually don't even say this is what happened, or that like this is the story we should proceed with. Normally, they do leave it a bit more like here's some options we don't know. And then they'll go down to something they know with a bit more certainty. Like if Augustus built an arch somewhere, you know, Augustus was ordered an arch to be built there. Like we can find evidence of that. And I do think from what I've encountered, that seems to be more what historians have moved towards, this idea of not saying this is what happened and we're only X percent, or I get what you're saying, that it wouldn't be a number, but that this is what we're pretty sure happened. And instead moving towards here's a few different things we don't know. And that's a lot of what I try to do on my channel as well. That's why, again, like I'm always big on providing people the sources and encouraging people to disagree with me.
Yeah, so I'm not. So yeah, I mean, I think there's no one right answer to this. I mean, some things we are absolutely sure of, and some things we're not. And where we're not, we rarely put a percentage on them in most papers, unless you're doing a STEM research. But
Sure.
archaeology, not. And and there is the stand-up joke in archaeology, which is if they don't know what it is, it's probably a ritual item. Yeah, So in a way, I say some
But
things
I
are
like
certain, some
I
things
even
are.
think what I read in my research in early Roman mythology, and Anthony does this as well. Like he's always very careful to say, we don't know this, here's an idea I have, and then he does a
Mm,
reconstruction. And I think uh some of the problems that have arisen from his book are people reading it and missing that part. I think in a number of ways, certainly his idea of his argument for the steppe migration and things that came out of that have very much been backed up by genetic evidence. But I do think at the same time, there's also like a lot to be said for him even coming forward and saying, hey, this is an idea. And now we should do research to see if we can find anything more
yes,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah.
So that's more where I'm saying, like, I don't think it does come down to where people make claims quite so authoritatively anymore, even to the point where there's an unspoken percentage attached to it.
Okay. Well, I've asked chat to give us some questions. So if you could, chat, if you've got anything to ask, put a Q at the front. So let me put this on the screen. Would be a good host. With regards to the number of twins
You've been a
in their
great
meaning,
host.
where or why or both are each significant to a particular region or culture in mythology? Do you have any answer for that? Or would you...
I guess. I mean, the number of twins that mean why, but I feel like that would. Why are both each significant to a particular region or culture? I mean,
So
I'm not.
I was going to
Yeah,
say
I might not
different
be
people,
understanding the question.
Cain and
Yeah.
Abel
Yeah.
versus Castor and Pollux, and it is a cultural thing. It's a high level cultural thing. The Indo-Europeans had divine twins and twins of creation, where you find in Near Eastern cultures, like the agrarian cultures, I tend to label them as, there is a bit of Cain and Abel, so sort of shepherd and I think it's almost pastoral farmer and agrarian farmer, but it may be a goat farm and a cow farm or something. There's a difference. I think it's just down to culture and what they were doing. And as we suggested, they may not be linked in terms of twins. They may just be, when the culture saw twins, they thought there's a reason to assign a particular story. They were special.
Yeah, I think there is like almost a universalism, a specialness to just the idea of like twins existing, period. Yeah, and in terms of why for each particular region or culture in mythology, I mean, I do think that's going to have more cultural ideas around fertility and virility, frankly, probably as well, because most of the twins are typically male in most of the stories. Like, yeah, I think that kind of stuff.
Yes, I can't recall a female twin set, to be honest. I see the twins then get merged into the primordial being sometimes. So we see that
Yeah, sure.
Ymir
Yeah, I'm
and
trying to think through Roman myth if we have. Yeah, not really. Definitely, there's twins that are fraternal, male and female, but I can't really think of any two female twins off the top of my head.
That's a great question. Okay, thank you. Next, what's your thoughts on Dr. Irving Finkel's idea that cave art was created by itinerant artists and that not every community had its own Michelangelo?
I think that's interesting. I think that's a good area of research that we could study more. I'm skeptical. I mean, I think that's my job on this.
Where that definitely isn't the case, because we see certain cave art where, for the ones of the hands, for example, there's lots of different hands. Well,
France,
there
I
was
think,
an
is some of
artist
those.
floating around a community, like different. You wouldn't have a painting like that. That wouldn't make sense.
Well, maybe they're stamping. That's their signature. They're going around stamping the cave. No, I'm kidding.
So it's interesting. Maybe some like that. I think maybe more on carvings or something like that. Maybe I don't know.
I think the problem is if you're going back so far as to cave art, just naturally what I'm going to think about is food. Because if you're trying to think about someone just shows up to your, your local tribe in the Stone Age and says, "Hey, let me do some art on your cave in return for some food," and you've never met this person before in your life.
Probably kill them, to be honest.
Yeah, but I don't. But maybe, like I said, it's an interesting idea, and if there was more evidence, probably I'm sure that person they mentioned has some evidence, but I'd have to look into it.
Yeah, Irving Finkel's a lovely chap. He works in the British Museum. You'll find him staring at the Lewis chess set quite a lot. I'm sure he's thinking about breaking in and stealing it. Not really, no, but he's breaking it.
I was going to say, people these days after the Louvre,
yeah. Well, they've caught them now, apparently. So let's see. Anyway, today, yes. Are there more myths that cannot be based on inscriptions than myths that can? More than not. Are there more myths that cannot?
Inscriptions specifically.
There's a double negative there. So I'd say there's more myths that haven't inscriptions than myths that have. So it's far
a lot of oral tradition.
Most
of our sources are written though. Like most of our sources for for myths are written though. Well, that was my whole thing, because mythemes, I said that must be modern because obviously it was after Dawkins, and then it was. Yeah, one of the things to remember though is a lot of our ancient memes are copies or later written sources. I think even the Norse myths, one of the things that we often lament is that I think it is fairly late. I think it's like 600 or 500 AD or something. Like it's fairly late.
13th century, late 13th century.
13th, wow.
Yeah. So 300 or 400 years after they were probably being told, and then they were probably a couple of hundred years old. So basically, we're closer to the writing of the myths than they are to the time that they were probably being preached. I was certainly close to the time of Tacitus, where some people think it's the same stories when it's not. But no, certainly.
We have I feel like there are those rune stones that go back. Like again, we know
Only about
some of these
800,
myths are older.
700 CE.
800, right? Yeah, because Vikings.
Yeah.
But certainly the writings from the later myths that we have, it's almost certain those myths are older. And there's been
Oh,
some
well, you can
very
tell with the
interesting,
language in them,
yeah,
yes.
and there's been some very interesting studies in Africa where there wasn't as much written language. So there are now people going in and actually collecting oral traditions and
Yeah.
transcribing myths from that. So like there is some interesting work being done in that space. But yeah, I mean definitionally oral traditions are almost
Africa's
always
tough
going to
because you don't
outnumber.
know. Yeah, Africa's tough because you don't know the corruption. So if you wanted to study
Mm, for
African
sure.
myths, Leo Frobenius is the chap I would recommend. So he was French, tended to write in German. So he's already translated an African story into German in his second language, and I try and
Yeah.
translate it to English. And I worry, there's a problem with comparative mythology. Can I compare a
Mm,
myth that I've
sure.
translated from a translation accurately? Um, so next, DBK at Crackenvold. Okay, are you saying putting Bayesian certainty on to the subject misleads the public as to the certainty of social like mythology?
I think this is for me. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I think I mean, to a certain extent, yes, and I would go so far as even saying that for social sciences. Obviously, when you're talking about like Bayesian models, you're necessarily coming up with something that is useful insofar as it can be applied to a wider data set. Um, does it mislead the public? I think the bigger issue is more the scientific knowledge that the public has, which I actually include myself in. I'm not, trust me, I have a Bachelor of Arts in film. Like, trust me, I'm not someone you want to come to for some like deep scientific explanation. But I think this is something we even see where like now if you read social science papers, they often throw in like 15 caveats. I mean, Lord, the not to anger everyone, not that people in the comments are like this, but the race realist stuff with the social science around inheritability, which comes from a misunderstanding of what inheritability means, which is just the observable phenotypical differences in a given population. So it's not strictly speaking something that refers to how easy or difficult it is to pass a trait on or how inherently genetic a trait is. Things like that, I think some of the ways in which science, especially social science, is constructed and communicated does make it can confuse lay people, including myself, who has fallen victim to this when reading some of that stuff for sure.
Yes. Yes. You've mentioned it. Papers aren't necessarily clear and on
Yeah,
what is. They come up with a statement and then 2 pages later they then try and clarify that statement, saying,
yeah,
"But by the way, we didn't mean all these are included." Yes.
exactly.
Gunter asks, could there be something like neuromythology developing? Neuromythology? I'm not
Well,
sure.
this is the John. This is for you because would that be mythology or folklore? Um,
If it's got gods in it and has sacred truths, then it's
so there
mythology.
you go. So I think it'd be
In my
folklore then in that
definition,
case.
that's
Yeah.
folklore. And
Um,
I love turning up to folklore conferences and talking to people who are folklorists because we say the same words but mean very different things.
I,
But
you are not the only discipline where that happens.
yeah, but yeah, I don't. Yeah, maybe. I mean, folklore's a fascinating thing when you really consider what it could be in terms of
Sure.
ritual behaviours and the like. So maybe. So more questions. Are you all right for time, by the way, Andrew?
Oh yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Right. So, what would the ancient Romans think about Bonnie Blue? Oh, I believe would they think she's
Oh,
Venus? Bonnie Blue, I believe, is a very prolific uh, content creator.
I
Uh,
was thinking of Paul
int-
Bunyan's cow. So I guess it's
no,
not
the
that.
Bonnie Blue, I
Um,
believe, is a female creator who is
gotcha.
prolific at creating specific content that I would.
No, but they might think she's favored by Venus. They might think that
Mm,
someone in her line sacrificed well to Venus, and Venus was pleased with her because a lot of times beauty in Rome, as much as they did makeup, trust me, Romans were not above, making themselves look prettier. A lot of times they considered natural beauty to be like a demonstrating internal moral goodness, and a lot of times there was a
yes.
divine quality to that. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, interesting. Are Solomon's proverbs scribally associated with that bit of cuneiform?
Oh, huh.
That I'm not sure.
I'm
The
also not.
question,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not overly familiar. I'm sort of like Abrahamic religion isn't my strong suit, nor is the translation of cuneiform. So I'm going to have to say, Sabala, I'm going to have to pass that rather than give
Yeah.
a
Likewise.
made up
Apologies.
answer.
Yeah.
Oh, AI. Very well done, whoever called themselves AI. What is comparative mythology? Does it matter? Luckily, we talked about it at the beginning. Does it matter for
Gonna
me?
say, yeah. Let's do the whole thing over again. I think we could,
You know,
do another 2 hours.
so it's the comparative mythology allows us to understand if narratives have an origin, a source that goes back in time. And the reason why we'd like to understand that is to understand, one, to reconstruct beliefs. If we believe mythology are sacred narratives, if we can do that, and that allows us to understand culture more effectively, can understand ritual behavior, because myths enact ritual, or myths in effect are enacted by ritual. So you should be able to understand some ritual behaviors if you could do that. So it allows us a better understanding of culture and society of our ancestors that may be lost to the archaeological record.
And I would say comparative mythology is a tool that is useful when it is trying to figure out possibly where things came from, how things are related to each other is probably a better way to frame it. And does it matter? Of course it does. Every single tool in the toolkit matters, and it'd be foolish to throw it out entirely. Yeah.
Hmm. Great question here. Do you think Neanderthals
Uh,
had religion?
this is something I could speak to a bit,
Go on then.
because
Yeah.
I did well, because some of my early looking into Roman religion ended up sort of looking into what was early religion like in Italy? And the answer is we have very little evidence. But we do have some evidence, even going back as far as, yeah, Neanderthals were us. I always get Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons mixed up. Again, shows you how much I know. But I think we've seen some burial practices where they sometimes get buried with like meat or something like that. And the fact that they had burial practices at all, I think, is very interesting. Now, does that speak to religion as we think of it today? That I don't know about, but what it seems to indicate to me is this idea of there was some sort of association with bodies, at least after people had died, and that's not something we see so much in a lot of other animals. You see it in elephants and stuff like that too. It's not like it's exclusive. And then the question is, what do you want to call religion at that point? To me, that would be
Yeah.
some sort of belief in something higher, but at that point, it's how do you want to define religion? Yeah.
That will be the next episode of this podcast. What is comparative religion? So it's very similar to mythology. Yeah, but I agree. Mortuary behavior, I'd call it,
Mhm,
is in where you have a deliberate burial practice
mhm.
was practiced by Neanderthals. We see it from as long as go as potentially 400,000 years in
Yeah.
Spain. You've got this pit, although the pit was a natural depression rather than but you see people with the same injury put in that pit deliberately. But then you get buried with objects and in positions and replicating. And when you see something replicated, then we can start thinking, actually, there's a ritual going on here. So yes, there was some thoughts. I've made a video on where did religion start, and I basically said with death. I think seeing someone who's alive and then they're no longer alive, but their body's there, that will make you go through all sorts of things on top of the emotion you will have, because no doubt someone somewhere would have loved that person
Yeah.
almost certainly, and they would, and they're thinking, where did that go? Where, and that's where some myths come from. And there's a whole
Mm.
heap of myths of why we're not immortal, which leads us to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden eating the apple, which is I would say an offshoot of that in comparative mythology. That's something with. So take another discussion, right? David asks, could drawing animals have been some kind of ritual meant to attract them so they can be hunted down easily, similar to invoking a god's name to seek their help? Can the artist be some kind of shaman?
I mean, I'd say, I mean, in certain cases we know that for a fact because I think when you look at uh, American Indians, for sure, they had rituals that were specifically related to basically supplicating the great deer spirit to try and make sure that deer would appear for their hunt. Now, can that be extrapolated universally? I mean, that I don't know as much. So I think one of the difficulty thing is when you're specifically talking about drawing animals, which I don't think was as common with American Indians specifically. Um, that I'd be less sure about. I'd have to see the cultures and where they came from. Potentially, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been. We've got what got me certainly in the European cave art. There's a lot of predatory or strong animals drawn, and part of me thought my own personal feelings were that are they trying to get the strengths from those animals to become part of them, so when they hunted, they could hunt like those animals.
Yeah.
So
No,
it's
I mean
almost
that's
a reflex of that, in a way.
yeah, and that's very much the Dumazil's second function. His whole thing was like the wolf motif was specifically a motif that had been inherited, whereas I think now much more the evidence points to more it's just very natural to associate whatever the big predator happens to be with like kind of your warrior class.
Yes, yes. Although there's a great. I'm just he's thinking again. He's done some great stuff. Lysa.
But Lincoln's also changed his mind a lot too. Like
Well,
again, I think
he liked those essays in Death, War, and Sacrifice. He
and
never.
I think it's really interesting watching him be like a hardcore structuralist,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
reconstructuralist even, and then kind of shift on it. Yeah.
Yes, if anybody, like say Lincoln, I think has done some fascinating work. But if
Yeah.
people want to understand that transformation, read. Is it Theorizing Myths?
Yeah, Theorizing Myth. Yeah, Theorizing Myth.
Theorizing Myth, which is brilliant, which is sort of, I really felt him, and it affected how I looked at myth. How he changed and realised some of his mistakes, and that I thought, he's raised some good points. Great, really great book. Certainly top
Fantastic.
10.
My favorite that I read of all of the ones I read. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll do a video soon, everyone, of the top sort of 10 mythology books to study mythology with, as well as narratives. I've been promising this since I started YouTube and haven't done it, but I've now got the books behind me, so it's coming soon. Anyway, next question. I'll move on before anybody asks me to commit to a date. Right. GD, any thoughts as to what kind of mythology was present in Catalhoyuk? Lots of bull imagery, beginnings of, i.e., religion, perhaps. So Catalhoyuk's in Turkey. It's probably the oldest city. As they said, and he certainly had a population of hundreds, which would be quite significant.
Sure, but still back then. I mean,
yeah. There's no doubt that some people in Anatolia, some of their would have migrated northwards over the Caucasus towards the steppe, and certainly we believe there is some linguistic influence. We believe then there's
there's genetic evidence as well. I mean,
and so you would expect there to be some cultural influence, but how significant it was, I feel it's probably less significant than that coming from Asia. I think the Asia culture, in terms of the myths we see and the narratives we know, seem to have a better overlap. But that I haven't done any comparative mythology, have no percentage numbers to give you. But my gut feel is I think there would be some influence there, but not big. The bull, though, we have to understand it was a huge animal to people back then, and it was the most perfect animal, which is why it became the thing in Indo-European mythology. It was like every part of a cow could be used, a bovine could be used, and the bull was massive. And we actually see at Saybirch, and I think I made a video about this. We see the first narrative we find, a carved narrative, which is a man next to a bull holding something, and then the man showing how much of a man he is, with two cats next to him. And what he's holding, I am 99% sure, are bull's testicles. And I think that's a ritual of manhood. You go and you castrate a bull. And even today, you go to, I know some African tribes, manhood is once a boy kills his first animal. If it's a female animal, he eats the liver. If it's a male animal, he eats the testicles. So
We do that in America. We got Rocky Mountain oysters. Yeah.
all right.
It's
So
It's bull testicles.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, well, yes, sweet meats, whatever you call them. But yeah, it's yes.
But
So
I will say, with regards to the question, I don't know that that would necessarily be the beginnings of Indo-European religion, because I do think, much to what John was saying earlier, Indo-European religion, certainly Proto-Indo-European religion as well, certainly
mm,
like came from a multitude of sources, and I also think a language does not necessarily imply a singular culture throughout that language, and I think that's something important to think about when you think about the migration patterns, because it's also that is another way to, frankly, it's a way to weaken my argument, because it's a way to explain some of the differences that can come about as the result of migration. The fact that you have these tribes that have some form of contact, and they may have some similarities, but then when they spread out, they have slight differences that get exacerbated over time. So I think it's difficult to even point to a singular beginning like that. Yeah.
okay. This isn't marked as a question, but I think it's interesting. Do you all think a lot of cultural myth has lost much of their authoritative voice because humans are less interested in daily ritual meaning and purpose in tasks and more prone to the mundane? Are you prone to the mundane?
I incredibly so. The more research I do, the more prone to the mundane I become. Um, yeah, I think I'd now say, I make a joke where it's like only three things happen: people kill people, people have sex, and people steal money. And those are the only three things, the only three interesting things that ever happen. Um,
Yes.
I think there's some truth to that, but I think, again, I think I don't think we've grappled yet with the idea that we're moving into like a post divine religious age. Like, no longer is our religion necessarily gods as much. And I think we've moved a lot more towards these sort of, I don't even want to say philosophical ideas, but these kind of vague mythological reconstructions of cultures and things we want to reach for. So I would say, to a certain extent, myth is still very, very popular. Well, maybe John might call it folklore, but like folklore is still very popular and very, very influential on people. I just think we've changed a lot of what it is. I mean, even John and I can tell you the amount of like magic both he and I do for uploading videos, for like, what time should it be? What should I put in the thumbnail? What specific words should be in the title? But we don't know. Yeah, we like, YouTube isn't handing us a list and goes, this is the perfect way to do it. We're like guessing based off past experiences and what other people have done that have been successful. In a way, you can almost see that as a type of like ritualistic thing of like praying to the algorithm. And I think there is like a way in which YouTubers often talk about that. So I think, for the most part, we're just replacing the idea of folklore with a new type of it, but I don't think it's gone anywhere. Yeah.
That's interesting. So yes, folklore will always
Yeah.
be
Sorry.
around.
Now
Don't
myth.
forget.
I'm not
Yes.
gonna. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But the myth, I think the big thing, talked about this before, is we've lost sacredness.
Yeah.
So,
I'd agree with
and
that.
I blame Christianity for that. So,
Okay. Well, hey, now I'm still
no,
Catholic, remember? But
okay, so by that, and what I mean is that when Christianity came along, it got rid of the annual cycle, the calendar rituals. People may sometimes call them, the things that, the year has cycles, reborn, and that. And when Christ comes along and the Bible comes along, it's canonical. There's a story with a start and an end, and it doesn't repeat, because we're still waiting for Jesus to come back, so to speak. So, and because that's implied, many of I think the ritual and the sacredness and of the world starts to get lost. On top of, society changes and technological advancements means you're not so attached to nature, and so there's been a number of influences on us being removed from being in touch with the world, and I think that is what is quite sacred. I don't know. To me, I love. Well, I used to love. I'm far less fit now. Walking through mountains and forests and the like, and there's a part of that. You see a huge mountain range and a great landscape, and it just really does something for me. It makes you feel
yeah,
human.
great views are always great
And
views.
I
Yeah.
feel, I feel that's partly what we've lost. So, but yeah, folklore will always be here. Will
I
always
will
be.
just briefly, because I don't want to turn it into another 2-hour thing. I agree with you on the naturalism thing, that we've certainly lost touch with it, but I will push back that I do think there are more cycles than you're necessarily giving Christianity credit for. But for the next
We
time
could
we
do
chat. The
we
next
could do a
time we chat.
podcast
We're
on
not gonna
Christianity.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, we'll
yeah.
go yeah, that'll be our next time. Yeah.
Right. Is there anything in Europe that seems possibly coming from the Neolithic farmers of Europe? An example would be Cernunos with deer antlers and Western European hunter-gatherers doing the same. So the Neolithic farmers, absolutely.
Yeah.
And anything with going to the underworld from Balder in the Old North Smith to well, anything like that, absolutely. So there are definitely agrarian myths. We get in the Greek creation myth comes from there. So that's there. If you're asking if there's things from hunter gatherers, which I think you may be hinting at, like Cernunos, that's more difficult. I'm actually about to make a video on Cernunos because it's a very misrepresented deity or figure, because the one everybody's familiar with on a cauldron, it's a silver figure of a horned antlered god. I don't know. Yeah. That is called Cernunos because there's a horned god found in the middle of France, and they apply that name to this cauldron found in Denmark, which was made on the edge of the Black Sea. Now, to me, this is the comparative mythology thing. I think that's stretching probabilistically. I think we're not 100% on that one. I think we're well down. But how far down, I will tell you in a few days' time. So, that'll come out to YouTube members and patrons by next weekend. But yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're asking for specifics, I don't know that I could necessarily say that, because I think, again, one of the difficulties, much like with Proto-Indo-European, is that we don't have evidence. Like, we can look at Yamnaya culture, but we can't necessarily look at Proto-Indo-European culture because, again, we just haven't found where their burial grounds were and their ritual sites were, if they even existed at all. I'm sure stuff did come from them, because it just makes sense to me that people living in a place would tell stories and those stories would continue. But as to what specifically, yeah, I don't know that I could necessarily point you to a specific. Yeah.
Okay.
I could see the gears turning for you, but yeah.
Now I could go off on a different conversation, but I'd like to end this
You're
before
fine.
midnight.
Yeah. I get you.
We lost an hour's sleep last night, so it's been a long day.
That's true, right? Yeah.
And Elfish, right? How much do you think do people actually believe in different myths as factual truth? Can we even know that? And do you think that's changed over time? I'll give my short answer, because I think Paul Orange has a point to a few videos in that. There was certainly cultures at some periods in time that considered their myths as the truth, but not factual truth. So this is a big thing for me. Truth is not fact. Okay, truth is what the opinion you believe. Okay, so when, let's say, President Trump posts on his social truth platform, that's his social opinion, not social fact. And it's really important to remember these things when people talk about this is the truth, this is the truth. Change the word truth to fact and see if you still feel the same about it. Okay, just a word. So it was always the truth. Myths were always truth. And this was the video I wanted to do 2 weeks ago, but you all asked me so many questions, I never got to it, which is that all myths are true, but they're not fact. And yeah, that changed over time as we became less willing to believe in the divine and sacred. Over to you.
So, I mean, I would say, in terms of how much, like putting a number on it, I know I got in a lot of trouble for saying, 80-20 in my video there, but like, certainly there were people who did believe that the myths were factually true. I think there's a really, really interesting passage from, I'm going to forget his name now. He was a Greek guy who wrote about Roman history. I think it was Dionysius of Halicarnassus, if I'm not mistaken. But he wrote about how this idea of Romans had the mythless religion. And then he goes into a long diatribe about how Greeks viewed their myths. And he said, obviously, our myths are just to explain why the world is the way it is and morals, but they're obviously not true. However, the uneducated poor classes, they all think it's true because they don't have philosophy to help them figure it out. Now, of course, this is a rich person speaking derisively about poor people, so you do have to take it with a certain grain of salt in that respect. But it's a really interesting glimpse into it might not even be like by culture necessarily whether or not people believe myths. To a certain extent, like again, I'm Catholic, we're not biblical literalists, so I don't have to sit here and say the world was created in 7 days, you know? But there are Christians who do believe that the world was created in 7 days. And so I think that much to that same extent, the answer is going to be yes to both always, but putting a firm number on that's going to be difficult. Because I think for some people, myths were just ways of explaining things, and that's it. And for some people, myths literally happened. And if you went to Olympus, you'd get blinded. Like, I think that's just how different people interpreted things over time. So that's sort of my answer, which maybe is either very satisfying or unsatisfying, but probably not anywhere in the middle. So. Oh, John, I can't hear you. I don't know if did I mute something on my end again?
That was
I
me
wonder if
that was me
okay.
accidentally
Okay.
clicking mute as I moved my mouse across the screen. It's
Yeah.
miracle what I can do here without knowing. So, regarding artificial intelligence, what biases are you detecting regarding to comparative mythology and their capture by ideological agendas? Regarding to AI doing that. So AI does have bias because it's trained on data, and the data it's trained on will create bias because it will know and then have a preference to pick up certain data compared to others. And then when a model is censored, there's two ways of censoring it: by either not feeding it data or by telling it not to produce data based on certain things, which again biases the output. So there's all sorts of bias, but it's normally the data you put in. But then it's also subjective. So why AI gives you different answers is to do with the fact that when you submit data to a public model on the cloud, it combines everybody's input at that moment and creates a large input, which is of a random length, and that random length adjusts the token ratio, which is used as part of the method to give a response. And that's why if you ask the same question multiple times, because that big length of questions it's asking, its big supercomputer, everything is random, you get different answers. But if you did it locally, you'll get the same answer. So there's a bias in using cloud-based LLMs for research. In case you didn't know that, there's an exciting bit of information for you. And in terms of ideological agendas, again, this is down to the data being used. So you have to make sure you're using good data and write really good prompts. So if people are really interested in my YouTube members and patrons, I can do a video on how to write AI prompts to ensure you have proper rubrics to validate your answer, and how to get the best out of a prompt. That's my feedback. To go more into that will probably bore everyone to death.
And I will say that I'll straight up tell everyone up front, I've been an AI guy since day one. I loved ChatGPT. I very much dislike it, especially for research purposes. And I think one of the big problems is the training data for AI necessarily is going to be unfairly weighted based on people talking online. And people talking online a lot of times don't necessarily know what they're talking about, especially about more niche topics. I myself, so because I would love to use AI, it would save me so much time in the amount of reading I have to do and the amount of research. But asking especially scholarly questions about very like hyper specific topics, AI is terrible at that because it's going to look at because again, you always have to remember the construction of a large language model is not necessarily to answer your query, it's to understand your question. So because that's what it was built for. It was the promise of LLMs initially was governments and businesses have far too much data for anyone to ever go through. We're going to give it to an AI and you can type out a plain English question of how many of our customers like red and it'll spit out an answer for you. So the problem that you run into is that's what it was built for, and then we're putting in the entire internet's worth of data, and when you ask it a question, that's the thing it's referencing. So the for me, the biases are there for sure, and much to what John was saying, even the people running the AIs can weight the biases even more than naturally exist online. But I think almost necessarily for niche topics, and especially topics you don't know about, I find it very, very difficult to trust AI because the number of times I've just thrown up my hands, I can't research something, I go to Gemini, I go to Bard, I go to ChatGPT, and I say, "Hey, what's this?" it tells me, I look it up, I can't find the source. It made it up. It told me something that sort of half means that, not really. I think it's very problematic when it comes to stuff like this. And I have straight up started banning people in my comments who say I asked Grok and it said this. I just straight up have started banning those people because
Never
it's
use
not worth it.
AI well, certainly the standard LLM models for any research at all.
Yeah.
I use a particular model for getting mythemes out, because mythemes aren't academic researchers. Here's a sentence. What do you think of the mythemes in that sentence? And I tested that for months before and even then I'm not happy with it. But
yeah,
I used it to go over 300,000 narratives, and it did that in 3 weeks, which would have taken someone 10 years to do if they did it manually.
and that's the promise of it. My biggest problem is it doesn't deliver that yet, because if you go to an AI and you say, hey, I want to build a business that, I don't know, makes cigarette butts into salad, it'll give you a way to do it, because what it's trained to do is to answer your question to the best of its ability. Yeah, to make you happy to a certain extent. That's a more recent development, but it's prompting is important. Like John was saying, doing a proper prompt is extremely important. But I would also just very strongly caution, especially against subjects you're not familiar with, going to an AI even to find sources.
Yeah, there are lots of YouTube channels that use AI to create their script. You can tell, and it really irks me that they get 10 times more views than me, and I'm like,
who cares?
I'll say I'm pulling my hair out. I can't do that anymore. But I'm getting quite frustrated.
I'll do it for you. But
they're teaching one thing. So yes, there are biases now. I don't use it for that at all. Still okay for time, right? Have you come across Pincola Estes' work on comparing the female archetypes across fairy tales from around the world by the Old Wise Hag, a book on this, Women Who Run with the Wolves? I haven't read.
So I haven't read it, but I've encountered it because, again, that woman whose name is escaping me, but like the modern kind of Dumazilian, I guess quadpartite, a structural person. She added wet, dry and wet to the things. She talks a lot about this, and I haven't read the book itself, but I've come across a lot of her ideas as regurgitated by other scholars. It's interesting, and I think that
she's got a very. Is that fair to call her that? Is she?
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, she's. But certainly, I think some of the ideas of the concept of femininity through culture is interesting. Again, I think for me, the interesting thing stops at using it as a lens, not necessarily using it as a conclusion. But it's interesting. It is.
Yeah. Okay. What more? I think we've got an endless list of questions, but we'll carry on until you give me a 5-minute warning that you've got.
Yeah, maybe another 10 minutes. I might be out of here.
Okay.
But, yeah.
All right then. DBK, question: what do you think about the Solitarian exchange of Clovis with North Americans? Any impact of finding Denny High speaking migrations in 5 CE, 11 CE from Siberia on your image of linguistic transmission? So we definitely have proof of Siberian migrations into America. There were some from Asia as well. I think we find there's 4 key migration events into the Americas. The last big one was the Inuits around 5,000 years ago, I believe. Maybe 4,000. It's certainly far more recent, I think, than sort of Clovis. But I'm not. Think about the old train exchanges, but I'm not familiar with the aspect of what you're talking about. Whether are people going back into Siberia? I mean, we do have one example where we could have seen a myth go back, and I think that's to do with the ferryman of the dead. So, if you're familiar with the ferryman of the dead from Greek mythology, there are some myths that have found their way into North America of that, which we have high confidence in being from the same source as the Greek myths, and in Proto-Indo-European myths with Gerlon. But I'm not overly sure, DBK. Do you have any thoughts?
I'm not very familiar that much with kind of later stuff, especially when it comes to the Americas. It's something I want to look into a lot more. But just again, as an independent researcher, much of my stuff has been focused on Rome and then other European things around Rome, because that's how I find all my stuff. Is like my previous topic kind of informs my next one in a way. Like a question comes up and I move on from there. So I wish I know some just from like education and being really interested in mythology, but to that level of expertise, I can't
that's
really
a very
speak to.
specific
Yeah.
question. Can't answer that right here, right now. Rebecca asks, in your video on the origin of belief, that must be my one, I guess. I don't, unless you've got a video called Origin
I've
of
got
Belief.
10 videos, and that's not one of the titles.
Okay, right. You talk about myth of migration. Makes sense. Have you studied anything about the Neolithic temples of Malta and the people? Not specifically of Malta. I did spend some time at Göbekli Tepe and looked at that and was looking at the narratives. And I'm one of the few people Lee Clare, the project manager, follows on Twitter. That's one of my claims to fame. He follows about 14 people. Heaven knows why he follows me. Yes. So, but no, but it's interesting. It's, it shows that we're seafaring, shows that, I think we are probably far more seafaring and water aware than I think most people realize in terms of migration and transport. But I don't know much about, I don't think there's any narratives within that temple, so I can't really say much about it.
I also don't know that it's or at least in the Neolithic era, it was a temple as much as it was just a necropolis or a burial site. But I may be wrong about that. But I feel like the temple was a later,
I can look into that. So maybe I could visit there one day because it's not far away. But yeah, okay. Let me cues. Right. Gunter asks, how, if this would be the case, would you connect Buddhist mindscapes with mythology?
Well, this would be Jungian, for sure. That's exactly how you do it.
I wouldn't, so I'll go. Yes.
Well, no, but this is also to my point. Like you can connect these things, and I think it's interesting because maybe that opens up other areas of research. But you shouldn't, sit on that and go, Buddhist mindscapes are just the Buddhist method of mythology. Like when I was a young lad, I thought Sufism, Islamic mysticism was like a way of getting Buddhism to the Near East. That is something I no longer believe remotely. But in college, when I was studying it, it was a pattern that made sense to my brain. If you wanted to do it, I think, again, read some of Jung's lectures from, I'm going to forget it, that place with a K. But basically, you take the idea of mythology as essentially like an externalizing of internal existence, and so you'd sort of take the concept of the mindscape and move it outward into mythology in that sense. And then, because again, when Jung talks about like the collective unconscious, I think that's something that gets misunderstood a lot, where people think he's assuming there's some brain controlling all of us, but really what he's more referring to is you have a subconscious that is just natural to you being human, and that because we're all humans, we share an element of it, but it's not like we're all connected to each other through like an umwelt of some type. So that's how you would do it if you wanted to.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, and I want to thank you for being here. So before we go, is there anything you want to talk about? I know you had a particular charity you support. You wanted to shout out.
I never sent you the link. I'll email you the link. Sorry, I totally forgot to send you the link. But I've been raising money for Car for Ukraine. It is an NGO that is in Ukraine, staffed by Ukrainians, where they buy cars and trucks, armor them, and ship them to the front lines. It's very important to me. I have family members who have been affected by the war through marriage, but still, it would really mean a lot to me there if you could go and even just chuck a couple bucks. You don't have to donate to me, especially if you don't have a good opinion of me after this conversation, but there are plenty of creators involved in it, and you can donate to one of them as well. It does mean a lot to me, so I would appreciate any help anyone could possibly give, and I will send over John the link so that people actually can do that. Because
I've got the link. I've just put the link.
Oh,
in
you
the
do?
chat.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yes, I've never sponsor anything normally or do anything like that, but just
same. I've had a lot of people reach out to me for like I probably shouldn't name names, but I've had a lot of like weird companies and like random apps reach out to me, and I'm always just like, I don't want to just interrupt my history with like, by the way, you should buy this. Yeah, but this one was one where, and again, I'm not making any money off it because that it's an NGO. It wasn't like I get a cut. Yeah, but it was meaningful when they reached out, and I was like, okay, this is one of the first things I actually want to throw my channel behind.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, thank you. Hopefully, everybody who listened to this learned something. Either that Andrew isn't convinced by comparative mythology even now, but we've still got plenty of time.
No, yeah, I did want to make this clear. Comparative mythology, I don't have an issue with. It's reconstructions.
Yes.
And so again, even in the probabilistic sense, it's like my only concern with the probabilistic idea is saying it came from a common source necessarily involves a reconstruction of a sort, even if it's not specific. It's just the idea of like, if it came from the single source, we can draw this mytheme back, so this mytheme can be reconstructed into an earlier culture as such. But again, I'm not trying to say comparative mythology is bad, because I think it's a tool. Even reconstructive mythology is a tool that I don't think is bad. I just think, again, you can't stop there. You have to then actually like do more research and see what you can dig up. And sometimes you can't, and then you have to accept that and live in that world as opposed to trying to build off it. But again, anyway, sorry, I'm rambling. But it's like I didn't want it to be anyway.
Yeah. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Andrew.
Yes.
I find your videos really, really cool. Go visit Andrew at Portable Orange on YouTube. He's just made a video about the moon landings, so and the conspiracy.
About the history of the conspiracy, not just a random debunk. Yeah,
that's really cool. So yeah, thanks for your time, and hope we talk again in the future. Everyone who's contributed on the chat, thank you. So I couldn't get to all the questions. This has gone on far longer than we usually do, and your questions are far more than I can ever normally answer, as always. But that's a good thing, because it means we can have another chat another time very soon. Take care, everyone. And yeah, thank you. Good pip.